Good morning and welcome to the committee's fourth meeting in 2020. Could I just ask everyone please to make sure that their mobile phones are on silent? And I'd like to welcome Stuart Macmillan, who is attending for agenda item 1. I also would like to apologise for the slight delay in start, which was down to some administrative requirements for the committee. So the first item on the agenda is the inquiry into the construction and procurement of ferry vessels in Scotland. No members have declared an interest before, so I assume that remains the case. This is the committee's second evidence session for the inquiry, and today we'll take evidence from ferries expert, community groups and local authorities. I'd like to welcome to the panel Dr. Alf Baird, the former Professor of Maritime Business at Edinburgh Napier University. Roy Pedersen, the author and consultant of Pedersen Consulting. Angus Campbell, the chair, and Ian McNeill, member of the CalMac Community Board, and Ushan Robertson, the chair of Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on the Western Isles. We are going to go into questions. Before we do, could I just remind those people giving evidence, you don't need to touch the buttons in front of you, that they will automatically happen for you when you get called in. Could I ask you to, if you want to come in, members will probably bring you in directly on questions, but if you also want to come in, try and catch my eye and I'll bring you in. And if a member poses a question to you or to the panel today, and you all look away at the same time, the last person to look away will be the first person to answer the question. So on that basis, knowing that no one will shy from answering the question, the first question this morning is from John Finney. John.
Thank you. Good morning, panel, and thanks very much indeed for your contributions. I have a few questions initially for the CalMac Community Board. I think the first one may be for yourself, Councillor Robertson. Would you be in a position to outline to the committee what impact the delay in the delivery of these two vessels has had on the island communities, please?
I think our concern is, when you start moving vessels around, you're impacting on the whole West Coast community to a degree. And as a manager at CalMac once said to me, all we do is move the row. So in terms of our concern is basically the delay, which when we should have had ferries in 2018, basically, and probably building an Islay ferry at the moment, and then going on from that. The impact on our community has been quite bad, particularly on my neighbour here, Eon's community in Barra, where they've had probably 5 sessions where they've been without a ferry for upwards of 5 days, which is, it's a serious issue in terms. It's not only the economy of Barra that suffers. You've got delays in getting food supplies into shops, which are then kind of at their sell-by date. There's issues with medical supplies and so on. So, and in the summer, we've got major constraints on some of the routes. Ferries are full. We're now filling up on shoulder periods. So it's a major concern going forward for us.
Are you able to outline, Councillor Robertson, because there always will have been difficulties, there will be with any system, the extent to which the failure to deliver these two vessels, and you said it should have been delivered in 2018, the particular impact of the non-delivery of those vessels has had? Is it compounded matters?
Well, it's compounded matters. For our own particular area, which was the Little Minch services, it was based on the figures they were looking at for 2018. The biggest demand was on the 2 routes into Arran on the Little Minch services. So, that was figures they were predicted for 2018. And the problem now is we're in 2020 and it's probably 2022 or later before we get these ferries. So the reality is, on island where people have invested heavily in tourism, for example, we're now finding in the summertime when their accommodation, hotels, is not being taken up because of the issue of ferries being full, particularly probably over 5 months of the summer.
If I could ask Messrs McNeill or Campbell, please, how CalMac, CMAL and Transport Scotland gather island communities' views on both the ferry service and maybe particularly vessel design, please.
I think it'd be quite interesting, John, to hear from these two witnesses on that very first question that you asked, because I think they may have views from other specific communities.
Thanks, Chair. I can give you a view from my own island, from Barra. Yushnin's right, the impact is quite incredible. Like he said, we've had 5 occasions where we haven't had a ferry for 5 days. I came out in the ferry last Friday and we haven't had a ferry since then. This time of year, the stores are empty, the shops are empty, the medical supplies are drying up. There's no, that's not any joke to get on about. The biggest impact as well is commercially. Barra Atlantic, who take all their shellfish out, they can't get out, so because they can't get out, the shopping can't get back in, so it's a huge impact on the island community.
Yeah, I think just to follow through on that, the impact that happens when ferries don't sail affects all parts of life. The lifeline services, right down to the decision-making of people, whether they can stay on islands or will stay on islands. And the lack of confidence that's now come around because the last ferries plan has clearly not worked. It hasn't delivered. People are questioning what will happen next in terms of delivery of ferry. I've got a figure, for instance, for Arran, that they reckon they've lost about £20 million out of their economy by the time that complete vessel will come on to service. There is a fear among communities that there will be less likelihood in investment in ferries in the future because of the outcome of this exercise, which has been so costly. And I think you asked how communities fed into a lot of these things. There is a lot of community fatigue in terms of responding to consultations from Transport Scotland in particular on what services should be and how they should be shaped. And time and time again, as a community board, we hear that they don't feel there is a purpose in responding sometimes because things don't change. The type of ferry, the type of service that you have put in place is maybe not what communities are looking for or what serves them best. And I think this process has just heightened that feeling of where are the ferry services going. We all know we need a major investment, 6 to 8 vessels over the next number of years, but there needs to be a direct community feed-in into that process in a much more clear and open way, and one that actually has an impact. And that comes from discussions we've had right across the network from the north to the south.
Thank you, Mr Campbell. I wonder, for instance, what we could learn from the community engagement, not just about you can ask someone their views, but it's got to be meaningful engagement. The impact that had, for instance, on the Stornoway-Ullapool route.
Well, I think I've previously stated, I remember the first consultation on the Stornoway-Ullapool route to look at the replacement Loch Seaforth. I think everybody in that public meeting was wanting 2 ferries doing a more regular crossing. The options that came up on the board were for 2 ferries, but then the next 37 slides were all about 1. And there was no mention of the fact that you need a huge investment in infrastructure to make that ferry work. Now, I think most people would like to see the money used in the best possible way to give more frequent services, allow some ambition in the programme to allow the island economies to grow and have some capacity to build, both for lifeline services, health services, but for the economy and employment. And it all is part of the circle of making islands a good place for people to choose to live and keeping the demographics right.
Does it give a challenge for you that residents don't feel their views are taken on board? Absolutely,
and I think we're a fairly new concept as a community board, but we've had the same frustration sometimes in terms of trying to get things done. We've spent 2 years, for instance, talking about equalising the fare for school transport, trips off island for people who are doing extracurricular activities. We've had 2 ministers agreeing to it, and yet we can't get it through the system. So they're paying 2.5 times what a camperman will pay to take children off to do art or music. That is the sort of frustration we feel as a community board in terms of not getting the views into the system and getting the outputs that we think should come out at no extra cost to the taxpayer. In fact, I think if the community voice was listened to a bit more, you would save a lot more money.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it.
You may have another question, I think, but there's a couple of members, so maybe I could ask them and see if you want to come back. Jamie, you want to go first, followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. So the purpose of the inquiry is to look at the current and future challenges and opportunities in how we procure vessels to meet the needs of the island communities you've just discussed. But part of that, I guess, is looking at the current building of the 2 ferries which are delayed. And I'm particularly interested in what the communities asked for versus what they're being delivered. So I have colleagues who are going to ask questions about the future and the sort of relationship you'd like to have with Transport Scotland. So if you could park your opinions on what should happen next to the side for other members to ask. But I would like to go back in time a little and if someone could explain to me what consultation you were involved in and what your asks were of CalMac, CMAL, Scottish Government, Transport Scotland, and if the 2 vessels that were proposed to be delivered were what you asked for.
Who'd like to start on that? Off you go.
Well, because I was kind of intimately involved in the issue of NV 802, there was absolutely no consultation at all with the stakeholders or community. Reference 802. We were told this is what you're getting. There was no discussion with us at all. And I remember quite clearly, and I thought quite a lot about this going back on the engagement we had with CMAL when the Chief Officer and Director of Vessels came to the community, and they were always willing to come to community to engage with us on these vessels. And we were given presentations of this very nice looking vessel on a screen. You could move it around on the screen. You could see where the car deck was. You could see where the petty area, the canteens, the lift, everything was. So I'd assumed, well, obviously that every nut and bolt was sorted and we knew exactly where everything was going. And then we visited the yard in 2018 when delays were starting to happen. We were then taken round the yard, and even then we were told that well, there was a lack of space when we started. It's been extended, there's a new shed, and everything. I left that meeting in April 2018 with feeling, yes, there is going to be a year's delay, but things are moving on. But clearly, in terms of engagement with our community as to the vessel design, there was no engagement at all at the start. We would clearly have preferred vessels like we have currently, like the Hebrides, which operates very well in our waters. We argued, the point we argued was why spend 50 million upgrading ports, 3 ports, and this expensive ferry when you could have probably done less upgrade on ports and at the same time built maybe 4 ferries like the Hebrides, which is a proven vessel.
Angus, do you want to come on the consultation side of it?
Yeah, I think speaking on behalf of the community board, we've only been in existence for 2 years, so we maybe weren't involved in that, but I can maybe pass on what we hear from the community, and it's quite a similar story of not having that input into things like the makeup of the size of the car deck or the number of passengers, how that works, what services are provided on board, how the freight element works, and that's where we've been, as a community board, saying there should be flexibility and even common design for different islands who might have different, like Islay has a real need to solve a haulage issue, and there are ways of doing that within the same hull. It's just to have that engagement at the early part, solve these problems rather than delivering a ship and then saying, well, that doesn't actually do everything we wanted, and that's quite common.
Jamie, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, so the feedback I'm getting is very much is that you're being told this is what you're getting, make use of it, rather than what works for the needs of your island community. So I guess if any of the other panellists had a view on if that was the right approach to take, would we be in the situation we're in if the government had said, actually, what do you need us to build and we will build it for you? Would it have been delivered already?
I think I think if I could say, like the Isle of Lewis that we have at the moment in Barra, there was no consultation about that, and she serves as well because she's quite a big vessel for us, but we still managed to fill her in the summer. The islands are getting busier. But it's a pity there isn't more consultation, because if there's one thing the islanders know, they know where a vessel is either fit for purpose or not fit for purpose. The two vessels we have this now as spare boats, the Isle of Arran is not fit for the Western Isles. It's a 6 hour sail in the Minch through heavy seas, and she doesn't last well in that. Frequently there's disruptions in the service. At the moment, the community are questioning why there's two of CalMac's largest vessels, the Isle of Lewis, in dry dock, and the Clansman at the same time. So that removes any kind of big ship resilience for the longest routes, whether it's Uist, Barra, or further north.
Stuart, you wanted a question?
It's a small question, and at the moment it's just for the community representatives, although I suspect our academics will make comment on what I'm about to ask when we come to them later. I just wanted to see the tension and your views on between what we require of a vessel in winter, which would seem to be resilience and ability to weather severe storms, and the primary requirement in summer, which is probably a capacity issue. And am I correct to characterise that summer and winter have these different priorities in the community's thinking? And to what extent do you think any design that we put in which will operate in both those seasons is always going to have to compromise one against the other?
It should be noted that even in the middle of summer, there's been, with the ageing fleet, large amount of breakdowns, and that has an impact on the
Do forgive me, as a layperson, I simplify things sometimes beyond what's reasonable.
I think the answer to your question from our discussions and our point of view would be that having the type of ship that can cross safely and be resilient in all weather, but having the ability to have extra frequency in the busier times is probably a better outcome than building a large ship that has more problems in bad weather. For instance, if you have a very high ship and you have a lot of wind effect on that ship, then it can cancel more of the winter crossings. Whereas if you had the ability to have flexibility in two smaller ships that are more resilient in the weather but can give you that extra capacity in the summer, that is the sort of answer that the communities have been looking for.
Sorry, is there numbers you can point us to that say that actually, I understand the windage issue, but are there numbers that actually we can look at that show that the smaller vessels are more capable of dealing with extremes of weather? I mean, I kind of think of the Pentland Firth, where the catamaran is more often off, and it's a lower windage than the vessel. By the way, this is open to challenge. This is just I don't hesitate to say that.
I'll just make it clear. I mean, I'm not a ship designer.
No.
I used to serve on ships, but I'm not a ship designer. But I think you mentioned that island people have a good recognition of what's a good sea ship and what's not. And the feeling is that, two smaller ships is not going to work in heavy seas or long trips. But there are the issues around the bigger constructions, and that there is probably an ideal size that would work, that as long as you have the flexibility to increase the capacity when necessary.
Just come in.
Yes, gentlemen, a very simple question. I note your frustration that the CalMac or CMAL comes and speaks to you and asks your opinion as a community, and it would appear that once they've heard your opinion, they go away and ignore it. Have you any idea as to why that is the case, that they'll consult with you and then they don't listen to what you have to say?
I think there's a third leg to that, to be fair, and that's Transport Scotland. The three things work together in terms of that process. I often feel, because you are dealing with specialist items and ships, that there is sort of we know best. The public can't have that sort of knowledge, therefore your comments maybe aren't given as much validity as they should. But, you know, we're not designing ships. What we're saying is there are needs that should be met. There are ways of configuring ships. There are services that are necessary. It's how we can work together to build that in. And I think that joint approach of having the community in from the very early stages right through the discussions would really reap benefits from all sides.
Yeah.
That leads on to the next question almost perfectly, which is from Richard Lyle. Richard.
Yeah, from listening to you, I think over the years that this committee has looked at ferries. We have different islands, different ports, different sizes, and basically it's a science on what needs, what a particular island route needs for their situation. So I think from your comments, I think we'd all agree that ferries should be built to match island routes to accommodate demand, both vehicles and passengers, and the ports it serves. But basically, you all have suggested that communities are frustrated and not being consulted, well, being consulted, but not really being listened to. So can I ask you, how would you like to see Transport Scotland, CMAL, CalMac, ferries involve island communities in their decision-making processes, re a particular ferry required for that route or routes?
If I could just comment on that, I think a big step would be to actually come to the islands and discuss these matters, maybe a day in the winter or on a day where they can actually see exactly what the community and get a feel what the community are actually all about and the problems they have. Because you're right, the boats that we have are either too big or they're too small. They either fit the pier or they don't. In terms of where we are within the pecking order, we never really quite know where we're going to be in the pecking order in terms of getting a new vessel. These two new vessels that are on the stocks at the moment, the community can't see the light at the end of the tunnel there at all. There's no light there, because in all the 2 or 3 years it's going to take to build them, where's the next one for use going to come from? Where's the next one from Barra going to come from? So I think that a higher level of, more level of involvement. The CalMac Community Board is a good step towards that. I feel personally that it brings us a wee bit closer to CalMac, but it's remembering as well that CalMac have a contract, and it's really, I think, the person that we should have closer links to is the Scottish Government itself.
So you're actually suggesting that somebody maybe from, I don't know where, Glasgow, Edinburgh, whatever, comes along to your island and doesn't know, doesn't bring along someone who knows from their company, who knows what's happening in that area. So basically you're suggesting that somebody who hasn't a clue what your island requires turns up to tell you what you need.
I don't necessarily mean they'll tell us what they need. I think what they want to gain a level of understanding, but what we tend to find is that they parachute in and they disappear again pretty quickly. So you've really only got them for a day, and that's not really an awful long time to try and show them.
That's absolutely astounding, that someone who doesn't know what you need turns up to ask you what, and then doesn't listen to you. Yeah, that really is astounding.
But we've been faced before with senior officers pointing out that they're working to a contract, and at the end of the day, CalMac do work to a contract. So maybe the person that we need to be chapping the door to is the Scottish Government itself, and we've actually been trying to develop that.
I've got a couple of more questions, but someone else may want to come in this one.
Sorry, can I ask a supplementary in there, which is very relevant to the point you've made? I'm sure people that have poured through all the documents will see a letter from Transport Scotland on the 20th of August 2015, which makes clear in paragraph 7 that the designs for the ship, and this was the approval of the tender advice given to ministers, that CMAL and CalMac still hadn't decided on what the right thing was as far as the ship design. And CalMac were arguing with CMAL about the design. Now, my question to you is, and on what Richard said, we've got Transport Scotland Ferries Unit, we've got CMAL, and we've got CalMac, all feeding in to make a decision on the procurement of a boat that's going to be run by one of them but not all of them. Do you think that's an ideal system? Or do you think the person who is actually going to run the boat should be involved more directly in the procurement rather than going through other government agencies? Angus, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I think a whole look at how that three-legged system works is definitely long overdue. I think they come at it from different angles, and sometimes you end up with a compromise that's the worst of all the worlds. I do feel that there should be a mechanism of having some sort of a project team working on these things that includes community involvement into that process, so that you can work a new ferry proposal through from start to finish with the community view in the middle of that mix. But it certainly is, there are conflicting interests at the moment in terms of what they're bringing to the table.
Just quickly to bring in Roy and Alf on that question. We've got three legs, all designing something which only one of them is going to operate. Is that a good system, Roy, do you think?
No, I don't think it's a particularly good system, but the difficulty is that there's been a long tradition within, let's call it the CalMac system. CMAL came in because of the European tendering rules. The whole CalMac fleet is such that the ratio between passengers and car capacity is very high, and in almost all cases never used. In other words, on the Little Minch service, for example, the current Hebrides has a passenger capacity of about 550. That route, no ceiling on that route has ever carried more than 312 passengers, and that was exceptional. So that means you've got a more expensive ship to build, you've got a more expensive ship to run, you're carrying a bigger crew than is necessary, and that's throughout the fleet. Now, that goes back for at least 2 decades and possibly more. So the current system is really just perpetuating these bad designs, of which the new ships are an example of taking it to the extreme.
Alf, do you want to come briefly in on that? And then I must hand it back to Richard.
All I can say is most of my research is international, global. So I've studied ferry markets in Asia and Middle East, North America, South America, and so on, Europe. And I think what's clear here, well, what I've found, even globally, is that public sector procurement usually ends up in extra expense, extra cost, bureaucracy, too many organisations, whereas the private sector just go ahead and build a ship, and they know exactly what they want. To fit the needs of users is quite simple. Users need 3 or 4 key elements. They need frequency, capacity, price, reliability. Reliability is built into frequency. Frequency depends on ships, how many ships you have. All these routes, all the major routes, should be served by 2 or more vessels, including Stornoway. As the people have said, that's right, and that is the case globally. Some routes have 4 or 5 ships, Norway maybe 6 in some cases. More ships, more frequency, more capacity, and this can all be done relatively cheaply if the ships are specified correctly. And this is where the public sector get things wrong here. They specify the ships incorrectly. They don't specify the ships as a market would do. They specify the ships in relation to the biases and opinions of the people who specify the ships, basically, and that comes from within CalMac itself. So that specification then goes into the funding mechanism through Transport Scotland, and then the delivery mechanism through CMAL, and all this bureaucracy. In global terms, that's really unnecessary. So I've been working with an operator in the Philippines who's replacing 30 ferries. In the past, he wanted to know what are the optimal vessels, so I can do ship cost modelling and all the rest of it. He eventually decided the vessels. They delivered number 15 last month, well, this month, and 30 vessels will be done quite soon. That's all within 10 years. Norway's replacing 200 vessels every 20 years, 15 a year. We struggle to do 5 every 10 years. And they're all wrong. They're all wrongly procured. So that's the difficulty.
I'm sure we'll come back to you. Richard, I'm sorry to have gone in on that.
So basically, size is a science. We really need to look at what we need in individual areas, whether it's a big ship, because again, I've been in trips, committee trips, where I tried to get my car on the ferry, but it was overloaded. I couldn't get my car on the ferry. and had to park it somewhere else. So basically the situation is and islands quite rightly complain if they can't get off the island in time because they haven't pre-booked. So it is a science, I can understand that. So we've got to listen to a local community, we've got to listen to local captains. Well, you know, it certainly shouldn't be somebody from Edinburgh that comes in and tells you what you need. So my next question is, we've heard it argued that a decision was taken to continue with existing ferry designs rather than scrapping the partial completed vessels and starting again, possibly with a different design specification in order to deliver the completed vessels within as short a time frame as possible. Do you have, as individual, any comments on this suggestion from the perspective of the island communities currently waiting for these vessels?
Briefly, who'd like to? I mean, I want to, Roy. I want to try and get this drilled down from the islanders' point of view, which was the question. We're going to come to you later. I mean, Angus, or do you want to comment specifically on that?
Well, I think certainly the timetable is very important to the islands, and seeing the ships complete is very important, albeit that there might not be the ideal ships that come out the other end. I think there is still a fear there of what kind of ship will emerge from the yard after this process, how robust it will be, what the situation will be if you do have problems with the build when it comes to operation. I don't think we're in a position to say it's better to scrap and start again. We just don't have that expertise. Maybe these gentlemen do. But certainly I think if you take this back to the bones again, you would be looking at building ships that are closer aligned with what the community's need is. I suppose that to get ships out the other end quicker, if that was the answer, then people at least would be good to see ships come on the list that would help in terms of the capacity issues.
Okay, Richard, do you have other questions?
Yeah, one more, if you don't mind, convener. So, several written submissions to the committee have argued that crews should be stationed on islands rather than living on board ferries, and that such a change in policy, amongst others, would have important implications for the future design of ferries, because at the end of the day, if they're living on the ferry, it has to be bigger, it has to accommodate, etc. What's your view on this suggestion, and what impact would this have on island communities? Because your ferry is part of your island, and the island is part of your ferry, I would suggest.
Angus, do you want to go? Ian, why don't you go?
Okay, thank you. I think it would be a great idea, and I think most of our community would agree with that. Having the vessel actually situated on our island, we've seen a big difference that she could actually leave rather than coming to collect us to take us off the island. Having the crew being able to live, where I stay in Barra, we're a very much a maritime merchant navy tradition. We have a number of captains that work for CalMac. We've got quite a large number of individuals that also work with CalMac in different roles. So clearly having 30 or 40 crew staying on the island would be a great boost to the economy. And so yeah, we would be very much in favour of that.
Well, also with their families.
And you know, it'll increase the pressure to get us to build more houses quicker, grow the island, grow the economy. So yeah, that would be a great step in that direction.
I'm going to bring Jamie in and then John Finney.
Thank you. Just following up on Richard Lyle's line of questioning previously, we learned in last week's session, if any of you saw it, that the cost to complete the current 2 vessels will be more than the original contract value to build them from scratch. So there was a question raised to the yard as to whether it would be more appropriate to go back to the drawing board and redesign a ship that meets the specifications of the island communities. Can I ask the island communities, therefore, would you rather get a ship more quickly but doesn't necessarily meet your needs 100%, or have a ship that will meet your needs for the next 20-odd years, but you may have to wait more time for that ship to be delivered? What would be preferable to the islands?
Oh, Who wants to answer that? I mean, difficult one. Angus, do you want to?
Yes. So
Well, is that the start choice that you face?
it's an option.
The extended time period to finish these ships is actually as long as you could build ships from scratch. In many, many instances, you could do that. I think the communities generally who don't have the expertise are keen to see ships come into the fleet because the position has been so bad in terms of having relief vessels. It's affected every single part of the network in different ways at different times. So the instinct would probably be to say, yes, we'd rather have some ships there. But I think having a look at just what you could do with that time scale and what you could do with that amount of money might bring up a different answer. But that's a personal opinion.
Thank you.
Indeed, and it's difficult when you see the tender document that the tender that was accepted was the most expensive tender of the 7 tenders that were received. John?
If I may, Convener, I'd like to direct a question to Mr Peterson. It's on the issue that came up there about, and I should at this stage declare my membership of the RMT parliamentary group. Nothing in life is very simple, Mr Peterson, and there are consequences to any decisions that are taken. I know in your submission you talk about design, and it's something that Mr Campbell alluded to there, and the idea that the cost of installing effectively accommodation for crew on the boat, it doesn't readily be the case that jobs would transfer to island communities if you didn't have that. But I wondered if you were aware, given that it's a fundamental work practice, people have talked about the maritime connections of many of the islands, of people living on the boats, if there has been any meaningful engagement with the trade unions, which there should be under health and safety legislation anyway, regarding looking at alternative models. Now, it would seem to me, very simply, if I may, that if you have 2 vessels, you could still end up with the same number of crew, just configured slightly different. But has there been, because you can understand there's a great reticence in some quarters, including myself, to see any diminution in the number of jobs that are available to seafarers?
I can't speak about the links between trade unions and the management of CalMac, CMAL or whatever. But the ideal solution, for example, for the Little Minch, that's the services between Uig and Tarbert and Uig Loch Maddie. The present ship is a crew of 34 living on board. The ideal solution is 2 ships, simpler ships, not necessarily that much smaller, but simpler and cheaper to operate, with crews of, say, 12, 14 living ashore. When you add that up, there's not that much difference in the personnel involved. Now, if the crew are living ashore in the community, the families living in the community, kids going to school, with all the benefits to the community and the Scottish Government's islands plan and growing population, the benefit of that is very real. Now, the other benefit of the crew living ashore is that you can extend the working hours of the ship by working in shifts. So you could end up with actually more people employed, but providing a better service, providing more frequency, providing more capacity with 2 ships, much more capacity for cars especially, and more revenue to the operator, which would more than offset the extra cost of the crews. So you're not necessarily talking about reducing the manpower, the person power required. You're talking about doing it all in a different way, a more efficient way.
Maybe slightly out with your remit, but you would acknowledge that's a fundamental and substantive change in workplace terms and conditions, and sure, you would want maximum engagement, presumably, on the way to go ahead with that. Presumably
so. I mean, bear in mind that in terms of numbers, more than half the CalMac fleet, for more than half the CalMac fleet, the crews do live ashore for the smaller ships. It's common practice. It is common practice in Shetland also, the Shetland Island Council ferries. It's common practice all over the world. In Norway, that's just the way it's done.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
The Deputy Convener would like to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Just to follow on from John Finney's question, I mean, it wasn't always the case, was it, that the crew lived on the ship? It's only fairly recently that that's been the case. Because it used to be based on the islands. or mainland?
It has been traditional since the beginning of steam navigation for the crews to live on board. And this is what's happening is a tradition is being continued that really is an antiquated one. I mean, in the days when ships ran from Glasgow to Stornoway and to up the west coast and to Islay, all over the place, the crews had to live on board because the round voyage took a week. So that's really what's being perpetuated, rather than looking at the ferry as basically a bridge. That's what the ferry should be. That's in many countries. That's what ferries are regarded as, part of the road system. And the way to do that is, in most cases, the most efficient way to do that is for the crews to live ashore with their families. It's more family friendly, for one thing, live ashore, and it's more beneficial to the island communities. So while the terms and conditions and so on would have to be negotiated, obviously, and these would have to be satisfactory, personally, I believe it would be an improvement in working conditions for the personnel involved in the ferries.
Okay. Yep, Richard, and then I'm going to move to Angus.
To carry on that, Roy, basically what we should be looking at now is the opportunity to look at how we staff ferries, how we manage ferries, and particularly how we grow the island communities. I don't live in an island, but I get it. I get it. Basically, how and people living with us, the kids can see their dad every night or their mum every night, and basically they can,
I'm encouraging you to the question rather than a statement.
I think we need to look at a new plan of how we develop our ferry service in Scotland. Would you agree?
I would totally agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lyle. Angus, you would like to ask some questions.
Okay, thanks. Convener, I should have declared at the start and referred members to my register of interests. I have a non-domestic property in the Western Isles. If we could explore a wee bit further the consultation issue and perhaps direct the questions to Councillor Robertson and also Angus Campbell, given his previous role as leader of the council. It's probably, I mean, we heard from Councillor Robertson that, and to quote, absolutely no consultation was undertaken regarding 802. So it's probably fair to say that Cornwall and Shire and other local authorities served by CalMac only play a small part in the specification of new vessels and the planning of future services. Now, I mean, clearly, if that's the case, then that's disappointing. I mean, I can recall when the Sullivan was purchased way back 40 years ago, it must have been, and that was purchased, it was already built in Norway and was purchased on spec, but the councillors from the Western Isles Council visited Norway and were fully engaged in the process. So, and the Sullivan proved to be, well, it's debatable, I suppose, but most would say it was an ideal ferry for that run. Now, we know that you're still awaiting the final report of the Outer Hebrides Stag assessment. So could you provide the committee with an overview of the findings of the Stag appraisal and the role that the two new ferries are due to play in its delivery, and also explain in a bit more detail what impact the delay in their delivery has had on the rollout of these plans and more generally island economies and communities?
Appraisals happening just now. We've lost obviously confidence in the system of consultation because we've had good engagement, I would say, with CMAL, CalMac, Transport Scotland all along. But the reality is that anything we suggest as a requirement for the community generally doesn't get listened to. And that's been a pattern all through, and that's a frustration we have, and it's why we feel that more cognizance needs to be taken of the views of islanders currently on the Little Minch services, we have a ferry that performs exceptionally well, the Hebrides. It's in the last month, when the weather has been particularly bad, it's performed very well. I mean, our requirement on that route is to retain the Hebrides as well as getting the new ferry whenever that arrives, and also are looking for 2 vessels on the Stornoway-Ullapool route, plus a new ferry on the route from Lochboysdale to Malik, plus a replacement for the Barra route. So that's quite a lot of investment really needed to provide the services that we need. It is a worry for us going forward over the next few years to see what is going to happen in terms of provision. Our capacity is extremely constrained now during the summer particularly, and as Ian beside me said, we see no light at the end of the tunnel as far as this is concerned. So I think going back to the question on 802, 801, 802 and whether they should be scrapped or not, I was rather alarmed at a meeting recently in Harris where a retired chief engineer said, well, if rust is set in and if there's water's ingress, they'll never be right. So that's a major concern for us if these ferries are complete and we get them on the routes.
Of course, if there's a delay, you know, if it would mean that the yard would be idle for some time if that was the case. I would agree with you on the Hebrides, though. As a regular user of the Hebrides, it's a hardy vessel that sails in most seas, and it would be good to see it retained for some purpose on the islands in the Outer Hebrides. The committee's heard calls, and we've heard them this morning, for CMAL to adopt a different approach to ferry procurement, particularly relating to the size and design of new vessels, and we'll probably explore that later with Alf Baird and Roy Peterson. But are these calls supported by Cornwall and Shear and other local authorities?
Yes. I mean, we regularly are in contact with Transport Scotland. We've engaged well with the Minister himself. He's always available to discuss these elements, but I just think that the advice being given by officials is I would argue with the advice being given. I think there's too much, I don't think there's enough knowledge, as my colleagues have said, about the requirements of island living. And quite frankly, in terms of Caledonian McBrain's senior management, I would make them all live on an island for 6 months of the winter. They then might appreciate what island living is all about. And I think there is that kind of lack of understanding that these are lifeline services. And for most people making these decisions, as far as I can see, they're more concerned about catching a bus and a train than they are about catching a ferry.
And of course, presumably the formation of the CalMac Community Board was to get all that over to them. So if it's been in existence for 2 years, something's not happening properly.
Well, I mean, as the council, we engage with Angus Campbell, chair of the Communities Board, at least every 2 months. So we have regular dialogue with the Communities Board, and I think we're coming at it from the same direction as far as I'm concerned. But our dialogue with the Communities Board has been particularly good and has been very regular.
Angus, you're going to have to come in and say that what you do with the meetings and the information you get.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the original purpose that went into the contract was to have a body like the Community Board to feed back information from the communities into CalMac themselves. And we do that. But the formation of a new body doesn't mean that you solve the problem of what then happens to that information. And that is still the frustration that sits with us. The other thing this Community Board have had to do, because of the nature of how ferries are operated and the contract is constructed and the new build, is talk to more than just CalMac. We've had to start talking to Transport Scotland, CMAL, and in some cases, remember, there's infrastructure that belongs to other bodies, whether it be local authorities or, you know, peers. So just creating the body, I think, isn't going to switch on the tap of solving the problem. we have had an effect on things like timetables and different things like that, on provision of services on board. CalMac have listened to us. But the fundamental issue you get continually from your communities is the resilience issue, the need for new ferries and a better and more frequent service. And it would be failing for us not to highlight that as the main ask from our communities.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just clarify that? So what you're saying is they're very happy to talk about the services on the ferry, i.e. whether it provides a food offering or tea or coffee or whatever, but not happy to talk about the capacity on the boat.
I think then the nature of the beast is you're talking to more than, it's not a simple method of taking information up the line that was maybe envisaged when the community board was set up, and we ourselves have had to adapt as we've gone along in terms of where the decision making is made on some of these wider issues. But that is what's coming back from the community. And I attended the presentation of the first form of the stag at the Corla, and the consultants themselves said quite clearly, really disappointed with the level of community feedback. They had come up against a real wall of community fatigue in terms of a willingness to feed back into a stag because they'd done it all before and they felt it hadn't resulted in any change to what was provided.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to move on to the next questions, which are probably more directed at Alf and Roy, who have been sitting quietly back, thinking about when they were coming in. I think your time's now. Colin, I think you're off with the first question.
Thanks very much, Convener. We've obviously touched on this issue so far, but I just wonder if Roy and Alf want to expand on why they believe that the design of the new ferries procured by CML, that there are actually cheaper, better alternatives. What are those alternatives? Other than, you obviously touched on that point already, but do you want to expand on that?
I think both Alf and I can talk about that. Maybe to illustrate the situation, why build a ship with a capacity of 1,000 passengers for a route on which, namely the UIG routes, for a route on which there has never been more than 312 passengers carried on any sailing, and in fact when the average carryings are half that, and in the winter time even less than that. So you're building a ship with a far higher specification, far more expensive to build, far more expensive to operate than necessary. That route also, this is the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee, so you're interested, I guess, in economy and connectivity. So a highly uneconomic ship that provides very poor connectivity because it's serving two routes badly. If you live in Harris or North Uist, it's not possible using this service to get to the mainland, Scottish mainland, and back again the same day, which is a pretty fundamental requirement, I would have thought, of any ferry service for a route that's less than 2 hours. Because the ship's trying to serve, the timetable's different every day, so you've got to think, is this Wednesday or is it Thursday, depending on what time the ship's running. So the obvious solution, the way it would be done in any country where ferry services are run efficiently, would be to have two vessels, at least two vessels, but let's say two vessels, each one dedicated to Harris and the other dedicated to North Uist and based on these islands, with the crews based on these islands. The crewing would be around the 12-14 mark. And with that, you can get regularity, you can get a greater frequency. And with shore-based crews, you can get longer operating hours as well, because you can operate in shifts. So it would be a step change in connectivity of the Western Isles to the rest of Scotland. And it could be done at a reasonable price. It depends where you get the ships built, but if they were built in the UK or Scotland, or Ferguson's, then ships of that kind should be possible to be built for the sort of 25 million mark. Simple ships. Passenger capacity of, say, not more than 250 because that would be more than adequate for any requirement. Where the difficulty has been in many CalMac services is the car space. Now, 2 ships would provide far greater car capacity, vehicle capacity, than the present arrangement, or the provision by 802. 802 is going to require massive investment in the terminals because she won't fit the existing terminals. So not only are we talking about the cost of the ship itself, completing the ship itself, but we're also talking about almost as much again to reconfigure the terminals, a bigger marshalling area, and new link spans and so on. Now, terminals do need maintenance, they do need renewal, but they don't need renewal to that extent if you're going for a simpler type of ship. So my recommendation would be scrap 802. We can talk about 801 is maybe another matter, but scrap 802 and go for 2 simpler ships, which could be of a standard design that would suit most island routes. I think I'll maybe stop there and hand over to Alf.
I don't really have much to add to what Roy's said, apart from to agree that the ships appear to be over-specified in a number of respects. Passenger capacity is, the ratio with cars is way too high for a normal, what we call a Ropax ferry. Normal Ropax ferry has 5 passengers or 4 passengers per car space. These vessels are 10 to 1, rather, so it's double. And then you have the very high crew capacity requirements because of that. And then you have the onboard living accommodation, so then you're carrying around the hotel above for the whole lifetime of the ship, which inflates the power requirement, the cost requirement, the emissions, everything. So these ships then end up, because they're heavy displacement ships to begin with, also carrying a lot of ballast because they're not stable hulls, they have to be ballasted. Then you're carrying around a lot of water for its whole life. So you're carrying a hotel around for its whole life, you're carrying hundreds of tons of seawater for its whole life, and you're carrying a lot of, double the number of seats and capacity that you need necessarily. So there's a lot of wasted capacity and spend there, and it gets back to the bottom line here, where those specifying the ship have no incentive to look for lower cost ships. They're specifying what is in effect a kind of mini cruise vessel to run a utilitarian shuttle ferry, which is basically a bus. And going back to Mr. Lyle's point about live on board, we don't expect people to live on board. Pilots don't live on board aircraft, train drivers don't live on board trains, bus drivers don't live on board buses. On short shuttle ferries, you don't live on board the ferries. And that's just an archaic practice. And it goes back to what Roy was saying, this when we changed to Ro-Ro from the old steamers, from the longer routes to the shorter connections, that is the time when we should have actually thought seriously about working practices. And there could be a real transformation in the number of seagoing jobs here, because we're actually underdeveloped in the number of ferries we have in Scotland compared to Norway. We should probably have at least 50% more ferries than we have. And that goes back to the lack of capacity issue, the need for more than 2 vessels for every major route, and also smaller vessels serving the smaller isles. We shouldn't be serving the smaller isles like Col, Tiree, Colonsay with major ships. That's like serving a small island with a jumbo jet. So you've got much more capacity going in than needed to these small routes. These islands could have their own dedicated vessels. And it's normal practice, I know in Orkney, where I live, that the crews are positioned on the islands. Orkney Council every week are advertising for crew for different routes that have to be island-based. That's normal, and also fits in with the need to provide emergency services out of period, out of normal hours, and going to different shift systems. So there is a need to transform this system, to bring it into the modern age. It's not in the modern age, and that's why we are unable to replace. It's not just a case of replacing this fleet, it's upgrading and upsizing the fleet to provide enough capacity to grow these economies, which are being constrained because of this woeful lack of procurement capability.
So obviously we'll put these these points to CMEL, but why do you think they made the specific decision procurement decisions on these ferries? And from a general point of view, why do you think they continue to procure what you believe to be suboptimal vessels?
That is a very good question that I have been asking myself for a long time. Alf and I both serve on what used to be called the Expert Ferry Group, is now called the Ferry Industry Advisory Group. And when these new ships were being conceptualised, I challenged the design. I asked what was the maximum number of passengers that have ever been carried on the UAG route, to be specific about that. I didn't actually get an answer at the time, but I knew pretty well what the answer was. And I asked why. Well, I suggested that a two-ship solution would be the better option, two simpler ships. And heads were nodded and nothing happened. So I don't know what the answer to that question is.
There are... Alf, do you want to come back on that? I mean, there are some other questions on this, and I think you've got
I could add that I taught and still teach occasionally in Norway for 10 years on shipping economics, and the Norwegians pay a lot of attention to education in maritime transport and maritime economics. There is a discipline called maritime economics, and I think that's what's lacking within the Scottish decision-making trio, if you like, is a lack of basic awareness of international, global maritime transport trends, developments, research, shipping economics, just expertise. And I think I related to this as a kind of bunker mentality, which they just can't be convinced that there's a different approach to this. And ultimately, as well, within that arrangement where CMAL appeared, or CalMac specify the initial vessel outline to fit the traditional requirements of the crew and so on, there is no real awareness of better options or a study of better options in that respect. So there's that kind of... but ultimately, within that, there doesn't seem to be an incentive to push for lower-cost, superior solutions in this. It's just go for the same as we've always done. And that's basically why Norway's replacing 15 ferries a year quite happily and 40 on order now for the next 2 or 3 years, whereas we're sitting with nothing, basically.
Okay, I'm going to bring in some other members. Mike, you wanted to come in, and then Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, panel. I was particularly taken by the written submission of Dr. Baird. In his first sentence says, publicly procured ferries in Scotland are typically up to 3 times more expensive than comparable private and public-private ferry procurement globally. So I want to drill down on the actual tender that went in. The contract value is £96 million for these 2 boats. And this is higher than the... Look, I'm just quoting from the Scottish Government's own paper. This is higher than the £80 million, including in the vehicle replacement plan and CMAL's 3-year corporate plan, which was published, this is a 2015 letter, which was published before the tenders even went in. So the 6 shipyards that put the tenders in knew in advance that the budget was going from 80 million to 90 million. Looking at that letter again, it says in paragraph 6, I don't know if you've seen it, it was made clear to tenderers that the quality-price ratio for assessment to proposal was 50-50. In other words, on specification and on price. Ferguson's was the highest quality bid received, in other words, the highest specification, but also the highest price of all the 6 yards. And I wanted to know whether you think, well, I'll quote one other paragraph from the end of this letter. This is a letter from Transport Scotland to the Cabinet Secretary, and it says, as with any procurement, a legal challenge from one of the unsuccessful shipyards cannot be discounted. CMAL have not identified any particular risks in this regard, and in any case, are confident that any challenge can be defended. That said, the relationship between Scottish ministers and Ferguson's owner are well known. And I wondered whether you had any comment as to why you think the highest bid of all over the Scottish Government's own budget was made and given to Ferguson's.
That's a big question. But I think one of the weaknesses of Scottish public sector procurement for ferries is this idea that they tend to announce to the world of shipbuilding yards and suppliers the price that they want to pay. No commercial ship owner would ever do that. They would want the best bids. They would never announce the budget to spend on the ferries. But the other aspect of this is the specification is always unique for CalMac ferries, complex, over-specified, expensive, high-powered, high-emissioned. It's non-standard. So therefore, you end up, and every vessel is invariably different in the CalMac system, so there's no economies of scale of production. So shipyards are always going to have to charge a high price for that type of product. It's like designing a unique car and building a unique car, rather than just go and get a Ford Fiesta or something. So here we've got civil servants who quite often, and even officials within CalMac and so on, don't necessarily know the best, most efficient options globally because they don't study it globally. And they're not necessarily trained to do that. But then they're designing something that is quite unique. But then they're telling the world the price they're prepared to pay for it. So the whole procurement process is dilettante. It's amateur. It's insane, in a sense.
Following on from what you've said, and perhaps Mr. Pedersen has a view as well, and I'm directing my questions to both of you. Your evidence so far to the committee, I think, is astonishing. That you're saying to us that, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying to us that in your views, this particular contract is over-specified and over-expensive. We can go into the reasons for that later, but that's the two things that you're coming to us. And we know, don't we, that the Scottish Government's now going to move on from basically the current two ships and starting again from scratch, committing, are they committing the same mistakes on the second tranche as they've just committed with the first tranche?
Well, yeah, I mean, a big mistake or a series of big mistakes have been made. And that happens sometimes. BC Ferries, about 2 decades ago, ordered 3 what they regarded as state-of-the-art fast ferries. They are very expensive. The first one, when she came on stream, was tried a couple of times, found not to work, and all 3 were mothballed and eventually sold off. They hung around the Burrard Inlet for about 10 years and were sold off at about 3 cents to the dollar. So that's a big mistake. This is 2 ferries, so it's not maybe quite such a big mistake as they made, but it's pretty big. It's good business practice when you're on a losing run to cut your losses and start again. Same when playing poker. It doesn't do to keep putting good money after bad. So from that point of view, just looking at the numbers, it seems to me, and I think probably to Alf, that the best option for this is to start again.
Last week, I think, was from saying that actually the decision being made is to just get on with it, because that's the quickest way, and hence Jamie's question earlier on, to the communities in the islands that they want this ferry service. And so do you think it is wise simply to just go through this just start this whole process as the government is doing again with these 2 new ferries for a similar £100 million cost? Or should it just... are you saying we should just
the time scale is to complete the ferries, and there's going to be a difficult job because there's a lot of problem. To complete the ferries is going to cost, what, 2 years, maybe more. We don't really know. You can build new ferries for that. Andrew Banks in Orkney got the Andrew built for £14.5 million in 2 years, including delivery from Vietnam to Orkney. And incidentally, Stuart Stevenson mentioned the windage factor on previous ship Pentolina and Alfred. They're actually performing better in terms of resilience to weather than Northlink's Ham Navo. When all CalMac ships were not sailing 2-3 weeks ago during the storms, Alfred sailed and Western Ferries sailed. So you know, that's by the way.
I've only got one final question, if I may.
Because I've got,
It just goes back to my first question, which I invited comment, but actually you've avoided comment on it. I did ask, there are 6 other yards put in tenders,
yeah,
and this yard got the contract at the highest specification, at the highest price. Have you any idea possibly why that might be the case?
Well, I don't know the answer, but 3 things spring to mind. One is incompetence, the other is vested interest, and the other is corruption. If somebody else can think of other examples, then...
I mean, I've got a list of people that want to come in, so maybe you can come back, unless you want to specifically...
I just think one of the biggest surprises to me was Ferguson's don't build the complete hull length undercover, which is normal international standard practice, and also gets us away from the weather impact on steel. So that, you know, from a CMAL perspective, if I was ordering a vessel, I would have been looking for a shipbuilder, and I've worked with naval architects and shipyards in different parts of the world that has an undercover construction for the full length of the hull before it's launched.
Just a quick question before we move on, if I may. You've made the comment that design and over-design and over-specification. I mean, if the government truly wanted to give the contract to a specific yard, could they not have bought a design that was already used elsewhere in the world and actually got the yard to build that design rather than have people who don't have the experience to design something that they don't know about?
I think what comes out from this is quite clear that CMAL use different naval architects for different assignments. The problem with naval architects, with great respect to them and marine engineers, is there's a great many naval architects. There's only relatively few great ones. And the great ones tend to have repeat production of what they have developed over the years, many years usually, which is superior hull form and bow shape. And superior hull form and bow shape, what that gives you is tremendous competitive advantage in lower resistance of the ship to the elements, the water. And that in turn gives you lower power but higher payload. Now there's only probably less than 10 of these people globally, the great naval architects for ferries. And they all are within or work very closely with the major shipbuilders of ferries, the Boeings of this world, if you like. And these are the people doing repeat production of what we call standardized, proven ferry designs. So there are many naval architects, but there's only a few great ones. The problem in the CMAL approach is they tend to appoint different naval architects for different jobs, different shipyards for this, that, and the next thing. They're all just niche operators, more generalists rather than specialists. And I think that's where we have a bit of a mismatch. The CMAL tender and the CalMac requirement is always a unique, one-off, custom-built job.
So just drilling straight down into this, if you want to build a Mini, you get the design of the Mini, and you build what's there. You don't go out and redesign the Mini and then build it to a separate specification to make it more complicated.
You don't get into
and it is possible to do that?
Yeah, you just pick it off the shelf.
Thank you. There are a huge number of committee members who want to come in. Stuart, you're next, then Richard Lyle.
I'm fundamentally going to ask some questions about the dual fuel. But before I do that, can I just ask Professor Baird about pricing? You have to publish your tender in the invitation of the European Journal, and legally I understand you're required to publish a ceiling and floor price. So therefore, the whole issue of what you're prepared to pay legally cannot be withheld from the bidders. Am I incorrect in my understanding of the legal requirements?
That may well be correct.
So it is correct.
But I would say in recent times, CMAL has bought 6 ferries, 5 for Northlink, 1 the Loch Seaforth, without a tender. And without any transparency as to price.
So are you saying that these ferries could have been bought without tender? And are you recommending that that's what should have been done?
What I'm saying is it doesn't seem normal to me, even for public bodies across Europe, the Estonian ferry companies and so on, to announce the price that they're willing to pay
The Estonians have to publish ceiling and floor prices when they use the European Journal. Am I correct on the legal
I'm
position?
not sure whether that's absolutely what they do, because certainly within the shipping press that I study, I don't see prices being announced apart from within Scotland.
In the European Journal, are you saying that there are contracts advertised in the European Journal that fail to meet the legal requirement to provide a ceiling and floor price?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if it's a ceiling and a floor, but what we see within Scotland is usually the price is a given for these
Was
ferries.
that the case in this case? Because I believe not.
Well, everybody in their granny knew that it was £97 million for 2 ships. Well,
well, my granny's been dead for many years, so I couldn't ask her. But I do put it to you, Professor Baird, that actually it said a ceiling and floor price in the European Journal, as it does with other Scottish Government contracts. That doesn't prevent a bidder departing above or below these in their submission. But nonetheless, you legally have to do that, and you're acknowledging that.
Sorry, Stuart, I totally take the point, and I think this, what Mike was trying to say is that in the corporate plan there was a figure allowed for the purchase of ferries.
Correct.
So, sorry, do you have further questions?
Yes, I do. I had hoped that would be rather brief, to be honest, but this needn't be long either. There have been some issues about using the dual fuel propulsion, which of course has been used elsewhere around the world. And I just wondered, in relation to the whole issue of climate change, where marine fuel is still until 2020 running on 3.5% sulphur, the worst area of transport beyond that is aviation, where it's 0.3% sulphur, and cars is down at 0.1. Isn't there a fundamental need to look at that? Now, the IMO are seeking to move to 0.5% sulphur by 2020, but I understand that only 4,000 out of the 120,000 vessels are actually ready for that, and the distillers of fuel are not ready for that. So, in the light of all that, is it a correct decision to go for a dual fuel option, which saves some money, but also fundamentally is a much lower environmental impact? And I'm not even talking about particulates, because that's another complication.
I think the reality is, for short-range ferry runs, as we're seeing, the evidence from Norway suggests that most of the ferries are either battery hybrid or battery. And LNG is not attractive. And LNG is more attractive for very long overnight North Sea ferry routes, Bay of Biscay, that kind of thing, but not for short-range domestic ferry routes. These are within the realms of battery-powered ships or diesel battery. Generally, however, the CalMac unique design has double the power of what I would call a standard ferry. And that means that if you ordered instead standardised utilitarian type of boats, and examples like Western Ferries and Pentland Ferries give very good examples of very low efficient, high capacity but low powered vessels because of the hull designs and also the add-ons that they don't necessarily have that CalMac specify, then you have half the power. So you could actually change the fleet just now with diesel, reduce the emissions by 50% quite easily, as Pentland Ferries have done, just by using 3 megawatt ships as opposed to 6 or 8 megawatt ships.
It would be fair to say, though, Professor, that the less than 3 miles between that Western Ferries operate across the Clyde is a fundamentally different ferry service from that, say, from Uig across to the Western Isles. That's an observation, and I'll pass on. I'll just close. I do note, and I wonder if you agree with the International Maritime Organization, and I have in front of me, they say that LNG is the best suited for new ships. That's the International Maritime Organization.
I think it depends on the ship type. There are many different ship types. There's tankers, container ships, ferries, cruise ships, long runs, short runs, intercontinental runs. Obviously, intercontinental runs you can't run on battery. So, but for very, very short runs, even just now, within 25-mile round trip, you can go pure battery with 4 megawatts of battery. And that can be done. And that takes Arran into pure battery, Mull into pure battery, Skye, Malig into pure battery. All these routes can go hybrid battery or battery tomorrow.
Sorry, just clarify as well, the LNG, where does that come from? Sorry, I don't know. Who supplies that? Do we know where it comes from?
Kent.
Sorry?
South of England.
South of England.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
So which
no, the gas. The gas.
The gas. Right.
No, I just wanted to check where the gas came from,
No, just to be clear.
because that will come on to... Yeah.
One sentence clear. I think Stuart is misunderstanding the question I had, because it's got nothing to do with the ceiling and lower price. What I was saying was the revised estimate of £90 million, I'm just reading from the government's own paper, £90 million is included in CMAL's 3-year corporate plan, which has already been published. So the evidence was correct that this is in the public domain before the tenders went in.
Thank you. Richard, followed by Jamie Green.
Gentlemen, this inquiry ensures that we can look at what we've done, what went wrong, and how we can fix it. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. Everybody can come up with... So we're still stuck in the past. We're still building ferries that don't suit us. So, and also, what do you say to the comment that these ferries were to future-proof capacity? Because I heard complaints when I was on the islands, oh, we can't get our cars, we can't get off the island, right? So, and now as you suggest, we should standardise, make it a mini ferry, make it a ferry, like a mini, not a Rolls Royce. Make it a ferry that is a basic ferry that works for all our islands, along the lines already discussed, and this standardised ferry could actually be built in Scotland. Sorry, I want them built in Scotland. Don't want them built in Vietnam, with the greatest respect to the Vietnamese. Want them built in Scotland. So, but a standardised ferry could be built here.
Sorry.
So, one of the best global designers, in my view, has offered Ferguson's on a number of occasions to do production line standardised ferries. And the reason why they couldn't do it was so long as CMAL ordered traditional high-cost, high-spec ships, they couldn't do it.
So my physical question...
It can be done.
Yeah, my physical question, sorry, I apologise.
Yeah, the normal process to do this in European yards as well has been to quite often build parts of the ship or even hulls in lower-cost countries, bring them to the Western European country and then finish them off, because most of the add-ons, the engines, the propulsion system, marine evacuation, bridge navigation system can be sourced locally.
Have you ever watched a ship being built on YouTube? It comes in sections, and they just you see it's amazing, and you can see the timeline, and you can speed it up, and it's like Lego, you know, it builds. With the greatest respect,
to ask a specific question.
Yeah, with the greatest respect, I want to put this point. Ships nowadays are no the throw up the rivet and bang it in. It's prefabricated in some ways, and I've seen them also cut and shut. Well, my question is, can we do things better?
I think not only can we do things as good as anybody else, we can actually do them better, but we need to bring in the best design competence for these hulls. And that's where we don't have the right naval architecture expertise, is standardised production designs that are proven. And that goes back to the hull form and the bow shape, largely as the competitive advantage. And that's where we need to exploit. Because otherwise a shipyard has no advantage. If it has no distinct specific advantage globally in terms of its design, it has no advantage.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to the next question, which is Jamie Green. Jamie.
I actually just wanted to follow up something. I've got some other questions later on procurement, but I think Emma Harper's got some questions on the future. I think it's good to look forward here. We do need to build more ships. That's a given. We want to ensure a pipeline of work for Ferguson Marine. But why do you think the decision was made to go ahead with the dual fuel LNG, not the hybrid model that you've just described? And what would your recommendation be on what type of new vessels we should build in the future?
Fundamentally, the CalMac design or specification of ship is too high powered for low fossil for zero carbon operation. It's too high powered. But if you specify a more standardized production line type of vessel of the type we have in Orkney, the Pentalina and its predecessor, well, it's Pentalina and its successor, the Alfred, then you then can have the same ship for 100 cars capacity for half the power. And that gets into hybrid battery technology quite quickly. So the reason why it went for LNG is LNG has got the support of like the IMO and so on, but that's mainly for long-range routes rather than short-range routes. It's the only option for higher-powered vessels, or one of the only options.
Okay, I'll come back later.
Okay, perfect. Angus MacDonald, you had some questions, followed by John Finney.
Well, I was the procurement-related convener, so I'm happy to come in on the back of Emma Harper.
Okay, perfect. John, would you like to come in?
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. It is on that particular point and on the question of fuel and propulsion, and indeed covered by yourself, Mr Peterson, and it's just to absolutely get on the record about the issue of liquefied natural gas, because you say, and I quote you here, and we are in the middle of a climate emergency, LNG has a slight edge in environmental terms in that it's a cleaner fuel than diesel, but it still produces CO2 when burned. You then go on to talk about the round trip that would be involved to deliver this gas to Uig and the contribution. Could you comment just a bit further on that, please?
Well, it's a roughly 1,000-mile round trip from the south of England to Uig to deliver the fuel. And that in itself is going to be probably a diesel lorry. It might be an LNG powered lorry, but probably a diesel lorry. So, I mean, I haven't done the sums on that, I have to admit. But it does suggest that it's going to rather negate the advantage of, the relatively minor advantage of LNG, hauling this fuel, you know, on that 1,000-mile round trip.
Thank you. Now, the Scottish Government have declared a climate emergency, and it's very important that transport systems work collaboratively. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that's the case with the ferry system? If we're going to have integrated transport, they must have regard to the total emissions rather than simply have regard to the specification of one vessel. I
totally agree with that. And in fact, one of the other things that you know, one should take account of is that there are opportunities to make ferry crossings shorter. That has been done in the past, and there are opportunities to do that in the future. By so doing, a ferry is a much less efficient mover of vehicles than driving them along the road. So, in other words, you're going to emit more CO2 and other nasties into the atmosphere by putting vehicles in a ferry than by driving them along a road. So, the shorter you can make the ferry crossing, the better for the environment. And we should look at opportunities to do that. A number of papers I've written have outlined how that can be done. So, totality of... Alf and I did work in Orkney, for example, on the options of taking a vehicle from Edinburgh, let us say, to Orkney, and the best option is the shortest crossing between Gilsbay and St Margaret's Hope.
Finally, if I may convene, just a very short question. It is about the role of Transport Scotland, who have responsibility for all aspects of transport in Scotland. Given their involvement in this process, is this a factor you would have thought would have been taken on board with regard to propulsion systems?
Yeah, well, it should be. And to be fair, I think the climate emergency is something that's been rumbling in the background for a while, but it's now you know, full square on the agenda, and I think there is a growing awareness of the need to address these issues.
For the avoidance of doubt, I wasn't ruling in or out any options, rather that we have to think of things holistically rather than on the basis of one individual ship or one route. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think the next question then is from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Thanks, Convener. We know that the Project Review Board have concluded that continuing to build the two vessels, even though it's going to cost us about 110 million, is what they intend to do. I think we've kind of got the answer, but I'll ask both Roy and Alf, do you agree?
that the vessel should be built.
The best decision was to carry on and finish these two ships at 110, at the cost of roughly 110 million.
Plus the cost of the terminals, which is another, a lot of money. No, I disagree.
I just ask you to leave the terminals because they'll be subject to a further question.
Just to drill down a bit more, Roy, you did suggest that we might finish 801 but scrap 802 as a kind of halfway house. Can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, I sort of put that into my my submission as a sort of face-saving measure. Personally, I think if it was me making the decision, I would scrap them both. But that might be a face-saving measure. And what I did suggest, LNG supply is, I believe, available in Orkney, so it might make sense for the vessel to be used on the Stromness-Scrabster route in place of Hamnavo, which is a gas guzzler. She's 8 megawatts of power and burning a dirty, heavy marine fuel. So that's a suggestion, but my personal preference would be to scrap 801.
Yeah, my suggestion was to redesign the vessels more akin to what a commercial operator would do, and that is to specify the passenger car ratio down to about 4 or 5 to 1. So that means you don't need 1,000 seats and 1,000 other bits and bobs. Take away a lot of the a la carte restaurant dining stuff, the fancy carpets, the art treasures and the cabins for the crew, the hotel and everything, and you've got a stripped down standard production line vessel to some extent, with the downside of its dual fuel and added complexity and cost to that. Not much better. It's still fossil fuels, so I don't know whether it's possible to take it down to lower powered marine diesels as well. The other thing, the risk of building the two vessels as they are, not only will they be vastly overspecified, as is normal with CalMac vessels, they will be running on fossil fuels for 30 years. And I don't think that's where we're going, to be honest. We're trying to go away from the fossil fuels, and we can do it. So I think the only option is to strip these vessels down, to build them as standard production units as much as possible, to reduce the cost, which I would estimate can be halved.
And is that
I'd like to bring in Angus, because if I may, because he's had some comments about whether the ferries should be built or not. Do you want to come in there, Angus?
Well, it's more to go back to my starting point of including what the communities need and want in terms of ship design. I was getting a bit concerned there, hearing about driving down standards and driving down the type of ship to whatever it is. That conversation must take place in the greater community, I think, to make sure that we have ships that are fit for purpose and match the things. And whereas ships can be said to be overspecified, I think communities still deserve a certain level of service, and we shouldn't throw that out the window with that sort of discussion. Regarding the fuel, I think everybody around the community board certainly want to see the most green type of fuel used. The ideal solution would be to see green energy produced in the islands that then goes into a battery form that powers the ships, and that is not that far away, and that would also have the dual effect of having a benefit to the economies of the islands as well.
Just to follow up on that, Angus, you obviously think that the fine dining is important to the people on board, because that was one of the things that Alf suggested we didn't need. Do you disagree with that?
Sorry, I'm touched. I don't think anybody's looking for fine dining. I think, but if you look at ferries all over Europe, they do have a certain standard of service, and we shouldn't throw that out the window. I'm not suggesting that's what these gentlemen are saying, but the terms being used, I think, could suggest that you have a very cheap form of transport that gives a very basic service. Some of these trips are long trips, and all I'm saying is that there should be that conversation with the communities to make sure that wherever we draw that line, it gives an acceptable level of service.
Yeah. Just to follow up on what your last answer, Alf, you suggested that we could use the hulls as they are, but redesign the inside, more cars, less seating, redesign the whole thing.
They're only designed for 1 hour, 2 hour routes, so it's snack bar route distance. It's not a la carte distance. And the other option, of course, is, well, that's if the government want to finish these vessels. They should finish them in a more streamlined and lower cost option. But the other option, of course, is if there is £110 million to be spent on ferries, you know, in my view, you know, go to China and buy 5. Or if you want to build them here, build 4 under license with some of the best global designers. So there is that option.
Yeah.
But to finish the vessels as they are, as the turnaround director suggests, and his review board, is also high risk, because the big risk is they don't meet the deadweight and speed requirements, and they might still be rejected by the owner.
How realistic is it, though, to completely redesign the inside of the ship along the lines that you suggest? I mean, one of the big problems we learned last week was these ships were being built, and there was no overall design. That was part of the problem. There was stuff being built, and then it had to be ripped out because it was out with spec and all the rest of it. You're suggesting to go back to basics and redesign the whole
Well, my
interior.
understanding is there's no finished design anyway. So they still have a blank sheet of paper, essentially, within a hull size.
Oh.
So you've got a hull size and a hull width. What you put in it, the configuration can be anything you want. And ships are cannibalised every day and changed and adapted and extended and jumboised, stretched, all the rest of it. So you can increase the width, the length, the height, whatever. But what you put inside it here is, we know from Roy studies and other studies, there's no need for 1,000 seats on these boats, or 1,000, or there's no need for 40 crew either. And you don't need to carry all that paraphernalia that goes with that. And therefore you're into the realms of just provide a Ford Fiesta, as it were, rather than a Jaguar.
Okay. What is, I mean, a completely different tack. What is your view on the nationalisation of the Ferguson Marine Shipyard and its future role? What do you think its future role can be in providing new vessels for Scotland's ferry companies?
Well, do you want to do it?
Well, just very briefly, I think I mentioned before, there are only a handful of the great naval architects of ferries around. There's a need for any shipyard to have a very close connection with one of these people. Otherwise, you don't. You can put as many naval architects as you want in there. If they don't have a proven hull form and bow shape that provides a competitive advantage, then they're going to be struggling. So that's number one, to have a long-term competitive advantage. State-owned ownership of shipyards is quite normal. It's normal in France to some extent, Italy and other countries, to have some equity, Finland too, to have some state equity in shipyards.
So can I just delve just a wee bit on that, just so I understand that? If I was going out to order a ferry, you would say that I should have confidence that there's a great naval architect attached to the yard that was designing the ferry if I was going to give them a contract.
Yes, some of the yards have their advantage. The best ferry shipyards, in my view, I can name some of them, like Flensburger and Vicentini, Ostel, Incat. They have in-house the best designers.
So if it wasn't in-house and they didn't have a close association, should I be nervous if I was ordering the ferries?
Well, yeah, I think the long-term sustainability of the yard would be in doubt.
Sorry, Roy.
As well as the advantage of the yard in terms of providing top-class tonnage.
Sorry, Roy.
Yeah, so the option really for moving forward is a partnership with a known and a high-value, high-class naval architect and designer. So it would be a partnership. And because I don't think the yard would be capable of doing an efficient job on its own. But you also do need a good management in the yard, and that's what's been questionable in the past.
I mean, just to finalise on all that, I mean, unless you both stated that unless we reassess the type of ships we're going to order for the ferry service in Scotland, we're going down completely the wrong route. And for Ferguson Marine to survive long term, they have to recognise that as well. And CMAL and CalMac and Transport Scotland have also got to recognise that. Otherwise, we are basically going down a blind alley. Would that be a correct assumption?
I think that's a fair description, and it would be spending a great deal of money when it's not necessary to spend such large amounts of money. If you do it right, as a sort of round figure and a bit of a guess, I think you could save £100 million a year on the CalMac contract. If you do it wrong, it could cost an extra £100 million a year. Now, that's £200 million a year, which could go to our cash-strapped health services and education services. My son-in-law is a teacher, and, you know, a lot of problems there.
Let's not work out where the money can go, because it's not necessarily on the table. There's some follow-up questions I'd like to take from Maureen, and I'll take one briefly from Richard, and then I need to move on to Emma.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if the gentleman representing the communities that are served by CalMac would like to comment, especially in terms of all the tourist providers in your areas. We've seen a great increase in tourism, whether they think it's suitable that any tourists might be attracted to the islands if they'd first got to go on bucket-type ferries, as these two suggest.
If I could speak for our island, no, we've benefited greatly through tourism, especially over the last 4, 5, 6 years. The numbers have increased. We've got 2 new planes serving us as well, which is a great resource. I think if we were to go to bucket-type seats in the ferries, the numbers would definitely drop. I mean, our RATs worked very much in our favour, and it's actually pushing the ferries and probably some of our tourist outlets to the limit, and the community are adjusting very quickly by bringing in electric bikes and hiring bikes and things like that. So it's been a great few years for tourism. With a 5-hour sailing, you need a bit of comfort. You need more than a snack bar. So yeah.
Thank you.
Angus, and I am going to let Roy come back in, or Alf, one of the two, to be decided between you, whether it's... I'm going to take Angus first, and one of you two can answer what you mean, whether bucket shop is the right description of what you're suggesting. Angus.
Yeah, just very quickly, one of the comments that was made by the tourism industry to me in the last couple of weeks is that the ferry trip is part of the experience of visitors to the island. And there's certainly a concern there about where you draw that line, and that is what I was trying to refer to previously.
Okay, so who's going to come back on whether the service standard is going to drop? Is it a bucket shop ferry you're proposing?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's to you know, not describe it properly. It depends. There's horses for courses. If your route is an hour or less, then you clearly don't need you know, a fancy restaurant service. If it's a 5 or 6 hour crossing, then that's a different kettle of fish. You do need a reasonable standard of catering and comfort.
Okay. Emma, no, Richard, I said I'd bring you in briefly, sorry.
I have tourist class or business class, depending on what type of ferry you want. But can I come back? I wasn't here last week. The shipping architect, or the architect, naval architect, that should be in a yard, was that architect in Ferguson's yard? Yes or no? Do you know that?
I don't know.
Sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Right, you said that you really need a naval architect, someone who will be there to build and make sure that everything's okay. Was there that particular person on the staff in Ferguson's yard?
Well, what I'm suggesting is there's only a very small number of great naval architects in the ferry sector. And you might compare that to aviation. There's probably only a handful of great aircraft manufacturers, and there's a reason for that. They have the design competence. So I think that was one of the downsides necessarily maybe of the people contracting these vessels is didn't use the best design expertise available, and that includes the contractor and perhaps the yard as well. So it's maybe a bit of both there. I don't think the naval architects involved were necessarily at the cutting edge of ferry design.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question then is from Emma.
Convener. Before I ask about what lessons could be learned, I'm interested in the issue about you know, the hotels on the ships, because the Stena and P&O have big ferries, 2.5 hours to get to from Cairnryan to Larne. And I know that P&O have many EU citizens that spend a month on ship and a month off, so they do require to stay on board. And these are folks that actually live in Estonia, for instance, and work on the ferry. So what's the difference between the Scottish ferry fleet? Is it that it's Scottish employees that reside in Scotland, and that's why your suggestion is that we don't have hotel accommodation or on the ships?
Well, these are much larger vessels, and that is, but most of the routes that P&O and Stena operate are much longer than the North Channel. So there's probably a route, there's probably crewing arrangements organised for the entire fleet through these companies. What we know from the Norwegian examples and other domestic routes, short routes of under 3 or 4 hours, is in general for these vessels, much smaller vessels, lower numbers of passengers and cars, it's not necessary to live on board. In fact, in Orkney and Shetland, for years now, the crews have had to live on the islands, and that's one of the conditions of employment. So the RMT already accept that in many cases, so there's no reason why they shouldn't accept that. And for example, Arran or Mull, it's only a 1 hour crossing. Why do you need to carry 40 cabins every single voyage and all the crew facilities, and indeed 3 times the crew that you really need? So that's where all the subsidy goes. The bottom line here is the more you put into subsidising an inefficient system, the less new tonnage you get. And Scotland isn't producing enough ferries compared to Norway. We're way substandard. We need to not just replace ferries, but also increase the ferry fleet, which is underdeveloped. So this system that you've explained about crewing is largely responsible for an undeveloped system and a constrained system that's constraining island communities. Fundamentally, the ferry's job is not to increase employment at sea. The ferry's job is to improve the economic well-being of the communities it serves. And this is where we have to get the objectives of the system to the forefront. As well as a green energy system, it's also about enhancing the communities, the life and the socio-economic reality of the communities. The fundamental objective of ferries is not to create employment at sea. Well, that's a side benefit, but it's not the fundamental objective. And that's what's driving the design of these ferries.
But again, like the Irish Sea is 2.5 hours, and many of the employees on the P&O
Yeah, there have been attempts to make shore-based crews before. Previously, Sea Containers used to run smaller crewed vessels with shore-based accommodation, guest houses and so on. That worked. These were quite remote areas in Stranraer and so on, but it has actually been done, and some cross-channel operators did that as well with shore-based crew. So it's not the case that all crews live on board. Of course, they're flags of convenience vessels as well that tend to access lower wage crews. So you're not comparing like with like here either. So it's a completely different type of arrangement.
Okay, so I'm interested in what, if any, lessons could Transport Scotland, CMAL and other stakeholders learn from how ferry services and the vessels are specified, procured and operated in, because other Northern European countries like Norway manage it really well. We've talked about that earlier, but I know there are differences with the Scottish infrastructure and the tidal way that the water works in Scotland. So, I mean, obviously there are things we can learn from other countries.
I mean, that's right. International best practice. We should look at international best practice. And in a nutshell, the Norwegians do it very well. The Australians do it very well. They're different approaches, those two. But if we more or less copied either of those, we would be getting pretty close to what's required. Scotland has differences from Norway. The tidal range in Norway tends to be, in some places there isn't any. In North Norway, there's more tidal range. In Scotland, we have greater tidal range in general than Norway. But that's not a particularly difficult situation to overcome. Just the link spans are longer in Scotland, that's all. I mean, we've kind of been through it already this morning. Simpler vessels, less passenger accommodation because it isn't required. By and large, simpler passenger accommodations, especially on the shorter routes, more comfort on the longer routes, more frequent services, shorter crossings where that's possible. That's the Norwegian way, and if we emulated that philosophy, then we would be getting better for less money.
And should we do things different then when planning future specification for our ferry replacement? Should we tender in a different planned way?
There were recommendations made during the ferries review, even a decade ago, to tender routes like the Norwegians do, which is smaller bundles, and also make a commitment for the operators to invest in tonnage. So the onus is taken away from government officials, the tripartite, if you like, and placed on operators. And this is why private operators don't bid for Scottish ferry services. It's because they're committed to having to take the CMAL fleet. And the CMAL fleet is essentially the cost structure of the operation. So there's no way a private operator can differentiate their bid. They're using the same fleet, same crews, same cost structure. You can't change that. So what that means also is you don't get innovation in the bids. So the private operators that we had in workshops even a decade ago they said what they need is smaller bundles. So you have small geographic bundles of routes, maybe 3 or 4 routes, 5 or 6 vessels, maybe more in the same bundle, and have the onus on the operators to then provide the tonnage. And really, in European terms, there's no other kind of asset vehicle like CMAL. That's a unique kind of vehicle where it's a monopoly provider of ships, and you take the ship you get. So it's a bit like the Ford, you can have any colour you want as long as it's black. You're getting that product. So there's no scope for innovation in the procurement process. So fundamentally, it's a bit out with what we've been discussing, but the procurement process here, if it was more in the normal European vein, it would be long-term concessions, small bundle routes, half a dozen 8 vessels per bundle, plenty of relief cover, plenty of cover, so you don't have this fallacy of the relief ship, which doesn't really exist anyway in the current system. But this is the way you then get the modernisation, and that's why Norway's provided 200 new vessels in the last 2 decades, and we've produced a handful.
Jamie, I think you've got a follow-up question, and then I'm going to have to I want to ask a couple of questions myself before we conclude the session. Yes, there's time for committee members to ask. So, Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. It's been a fascinating discussion this morning. I think one of the difficulties the committee has with an inquiry of this nature is that in order to look forward, we have had to look back. But what we will see, and we are seeing already, is a sort of merry-go-round of blame. You've got a workforce who are doing what they're told, building what they're told to build, a yard which is building a design which it was given, a client which is given ships to an operator who operates the franchise, but within the constrictions of the ships that it's given. You've got Transport Scotland, who can only build ships according to the budget they're given by the government, and so on. And what seems to me is a picture of a very complex structure of how we procure, how we build, how we design, and how we deliver ferries in Scotland. Moving forward, if we could learn some fundamental lessons from the last decade or two, what would you do differently? What immediately could we do differently to ensure that we get a new fleet of vessels delivered to serve our island communities?
Roy, and can I ask you, there's probably a huge long list that you want to mention. Maybe could I ask you to keep it to 2 simple things that could help us with that?
Develop a standard design, a simple standard design for application on perhaps the shorter routes in Scotland, and put out a contract to get them built using an accredited naval architect and designer in a joint venture.
Alf, do you want to add anything?
I think that there has to be that same kind of vision, using standardised approach, the best competence. And we're not, the people deciding what we get in terms of ferries are not the best in terms of competence to do that, in my view. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the vision, or they're maybe limited in other respects politically for some reason, I don't know. The RMT is also another thing, aspect here that has to be brought into the equation, and I think there's potentially a lot more jobs to be had. But essentially, Scotland needs to be producing at least 5 new ferries a year, 5 new ferries every year, to even get close to Norway in terms of what we provide. And we are struggling to provide one every 2 years. So we are at 10% of what Norway is.
Okay. Mike, you wanted to come in briefly.
Very briefly, Convener, thank you for that. I know Richard Lyle asked witnesses about the chief architect or architect at Naval Architects at Ferguson Marines. And the questions, the answers that we've had about this whole issue, I think is really important. But I think it's important to put on record that Mr. Andrew Alexander was the chief naval architect at Ferguson Marine. He was due and had been invited, and I believe had accepted the invitation to appear today. And I think on listening to the evidence that our witnesses have given, I think it would be appropriate if the committee would consider, if the convener would consider inviting Mr. Alexander to give evidence, because I think he might want to come and give us the evidence on that.
Well, I think it's something for that, in answer to the question, which is not directed at the panel, is something that the committee may wish to reflect on post this meeting. But I've noted your comment. I'm afraid our time is running out, and I have a couple of very quick questions, if I may, at the end. One is that when I looked at the tender documents that's been referred to by both myself and Mr. Rumbles earlier today, it says, on the basis of information, and I quote it, to us at this point, and this is written by Transport Scotland to the Scottish Government, the risk of major infrastructure requirements to accommodate these vessels is considered to be low. I'm now confused why you said that the vessels were quite big, and some of the evidence I've heard is that the island communities, some of the assets belong to them, and they're having to build them. So could you just clarify, is that correct or not?
That the impact on infrastructure is low?
Well, the infrastructure requirement to accommodate these vessels, the requirement for additional major infrastructure requirements to accommodate these vessels is considered to be low.
I would disagree with that. I would consider it to be high.
Okay. Councillor, do you have a view on that?
Well, I mean, we've got the pier in Lochmarrie, North Uist, is owned by the council, of course. The one in Harris is owned by Seamull, and the one in Oog is owned by Highland Council. Clearly, if they had gone with the our preference was some vessels along the size of the Hebrides, although there was some infrastructure work to be done, it was certainly nowhere near the order of 50-odd million, which is required now.
So do you think that looking at the construction and the build of these vessels, an intricate part of that, that contract should have been consideration of the infrastructure to accommodate them?
Absolutely.
So I'm seeing nods of the head, and that would include the fuel storage facilities, which haven't been mentioned at all at this stage for the LNG. And I'm not voicing an opinion on whether that's a right fuel or not, but there's no mention of that.
Yeah.
Would that be right?
Yeah.
In terms of the question Mr. Finney asked on LNG, I believe there's been discussions between Seamull and Maui and Kailakan, who I believe use LNG. But
Indeed, and I think when we were at the plant up there, there were some discussions about LNG and the storage that they were using there. I think that's right. Okay, thank you. I'm afraid.
Point out that the local member, Stuart McMillan, has been here for the last 2 hours, and I'm sure it's custom and practice in this committee when a member comes along that the member is allowed to ask questions. So I would suggest that the member be allowed a few minutes at least to ask questions as the local member.
Mr. Lyle, this evidence session was due to finish some time ago. I have given the committee...
It'd be the first time
Mr. Lyle, please, would you listen to me? I have given as much time as I can to committee members to ask questions. Unfortunately, our time is at an end. And it is up to the convener of the committee, in the same way it is up to the presiding officer in the chamber, to decide where the questions were. And I'm afraid at this time, I've made the assessment in the management of time.
That I've found a member who's come along has not been allowed to ask his questions.
Sorry.
And I record my dissent.
I understand. No, I'm sorry. This conversation has gone as far as it's going. I'm afraid we are out of time. I would therefore like to thank the panel for giving evidence today. And I should also like to point out that if there's any chance that they want to add anything that they've said today, unfortunately we've run out of time. The committee will take written submissions and we'd be very welcome to receive them. So I'd like to briefly suspend the meeting for 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, and I'd now like to reconvene the meeting, and I'd like to move on to agenda item 2, which is digital connectivity. Today, we will take evidence from the Minister and his officials on digital connectivity issues, including R100. I'd like to welcome to the panel Paul Wheelhouse, Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands for the Scottish Government, Claire Bate, the R100 Commercial Director, and Robbie McGee, the Head of Digital Connectivity. Minister, would you like to make a brief opening statement of up to 2 minutes?
I will. Thank you, Convener, and welcome the chance to address the committee this morning. The Government is committed to closing the digital divide, and over the last 5 years we have seen a significant improvement in the availability of superfast broadband, with coverage increasing by 35 percentage points from 59% in 2014 to 94% in 2019. This increase is in part due to the success of our £400 million Digital Scotland Superfast or DSSB programme. As a direct result of DSSB, over 943,000 premises across the length and breadth of Scotland can now access fibre broadband, around 103,000 more than originally anticipated. Before DSSB began, only 21% of premises in the Highlands were expected to have access to fibre broadband, with no planned coverage at all in Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles. Today, over 93% of premises in the Highlands and over 80% of premises in Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles can access fibre broadband. And as a result of higher than expected take-up of services on the DSSB funded infrastructure, a total of £38.7 million has been reinvested in the programme through a contractual mechanism known as gain share. This additional funding will ensure that DSSB will go further still, with deployment set to continue during 2020. However, the provision of broadband infrastructure is primarily a commercial matter. On that front, infrastructure providers continue to roll out services, aided by our 10 years rates relief on newly laid and lit fibre. Commercial providers will continue to play an important role in meeting our digital connectivity ambitions. Turning to R100 itself, we do of course recognise that more needs to be done. And that is why the Government has chosen to invest in order to extend superfast broadband access to 100% of premises across Scotland by the end of 2021 through the Reaching 100% programme, which of course, as we've discussed before at committee, includes aligned interventions. At the end of last year, I announced that we had signed contracts with BT for central and south lots of the R100 procurement. I also announced that the contract award for the north lot was subject to a legal challenge, and until that challenge was heard and resolved, we were unable to award the contract as planned. Upon completion of the R100 programme, Scotland will be the only part of the UK with universal superfast broadband access, ensuring that Scotland is ahead of the curve. And of course, many areas are getting extensive full fibre coverage through our R100 contracts. I'll be happy to take members' questions, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And there are a lot of questions, and as ever, committee's time is short, especially with, I think, an earlier sitting today. So the first question is from Jamie Green. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Thank you for coming along. Let's start with just taking a step back, looking at the overall bigger picture of what the R100 delivers. The Government announced a budget of £600 million for this project. The project, I understand, has 3 elements: the procurement, the commercial build and the aligned interventions. We are going to talk about aligned interventions late in the session, so I'll park that aside for now if you don't mind. Can you just talk me through what the £600 million buys us, which elements of those contracts it pays for?
It's a very helpful question. The £600 million is the main procurement under R100. That is recognising there are white space areas, as are known that we cannot, through the open market review, identify any commercial build that was planned for those areas at the time of the open market review. Therefore, those are the eligible premises that go forward through the main procurement, which we have obviously tendered and are at various stages, obviously, as I've outlined in my opening remarks, of signing those contracts. So the £600 million is spread across 3 different lots. So there's £384 million allocated for the north lot area, which is obviously the subject to legal challenge, £133 million for the south of Scotland area, and £83 million for the central lot area. And that will be paying for the installation of infrastructure. In the case of South of Scotland, full fibre for all but just over 200 of the 26,000 premises that were identified for that area, and we've obviously a target list of 55,000 for the central area, of which the vast majority are going to get full fibre. Others will get FTTC or fibre to the cabinet solutions.
So just to clarify then, so the 600 million that the government will presumably put into the relevant budget years, we'll see that when the budget's presented to us, is for the spending in the areas in which there is no commercially viable option. So in other words, what we would expect in order to reach 100 is that the 600 million itself won't reach the 100. It's the 600 million of the government intervention plus the commercial build, which you've had advance notice of from commercial providers, plus the aligned interventions. So therefore, could we get a picture of what you think the overall required spend is to get to R100? Because it's not simply R100 equals 600 million. It sounds to me like R100 equals 600 million plus commercial, plus aligned interventions. So what are those other numbers?
It's difficult to give a financial figure to this, but you're quite correct. Mr Green's quite correct that there are three different groups, and the two that he's referred to, principal ones, are the R100 itself plus the commercial build. Through the open market review process, the Scottish Government gathered information in commercial superfast plans, which Mr Green has alluded to, and that's absolutely right. That informs our intervention area. But the operators don't tell us how much they're spending to deliver that coverage. So that's the bit that's difficult for us. But there's no mechanism for us to obtain that information, which we deemed commercially confidential by each of the different developers. Extensive scoping work has been undertaken, though, to evaluate the likely cost of delivering broadband vouchers for ourselves. But I do have access to figures which we can supply to committee about the anticipated commercial rollout. It is being adjusted, though, as I think I've alluded in the statement I gave to Parliament, that following the announcement of the contracts, we have to take account of the latest available information about commercial build in each of the two areas we've contracted for already, and that process is being adjusted by BT themselves to adjust their design to make sure they're not covering areas with our money that would be being delivered by commercial developers. But we can give some figures to the committee if that would be helpful, convener, which will help. I do have some which may be out of date I could give to the committee now, if that would be helpful, to give an indication that, for example, in the central area, which covers much of central Scotland, obviously south of Broadley Dundee and Doon and Stirling, sort of southwards, there were originally 1.938 million premises that were needing to be targeted. 1.737 million had already been connected. That left, we had 102,000 that we were aware of that were being built by commercial developers, and that left just about 55,000 that we had to tackle through the R100 procurement, of which I've given figures in the chamber, and I can repeat today if helpful. 87% of those will be delivered through the central R100 contract. The remainder, leaving the small number of, relatively small number, about just over 7,000, in the central area will have to be delivered through our aligned interventions. Okay. So I hope that gives a sense of scale as to where we've got to. So there's over 100,000 we know of at that point when the OMR was done for the central area that were going to be done commercially. And we are topping that up with the R100 programme, the properties that, if you like, required subsidy to be addressed. In the south area, the equivalent figures, much smaller area, of course, in terms of population, just under 200,000, 198,979 premises originally that are in that area, eligible area. 156,165 had already been connected, and therefore we knew of 10,600, just over 10,600 commercially planned investments across the south of Scotland area, which left the 26,000, just over 26,000 figure that I've mentioned previously in the chamber, and of that 99% will get a full fibre solution. So that hopefully gives a context, but we can give some figures to committees following the session, which will, and obviously as the design is finalised, we'll be able to finalise those figures later in the year.
I fear we may be venturing some other questions as we get into the minutiae, but thank you for the information. So just to, again, I'm just looking at the overall picture of this. I'll park aside the north lot, given the sensitivities around that. But the south and central lot are contracts which are already being signed. So when you signed those contracts, and again, I think perhaps there's still some lack of clarity about what the nature of those contracts is. What are you contracting those suppliers to actually deliver? Did you not have a sense of, this is how much we're putting into this to deliver the household to the households which you're not going to deliver to? What are you putting into this deal? Or again, is that commercially sensitive information which you either don't know or you do know but you can't share?
We can say, I think, just check, I can give a figure for the amount that BT is putting in collectively to Central and South, if that's helpful.
Yes.
So on top of the investment in total from ourselves and 3.5% obviously coming from UK government as well, that's a total of 600 million across the 3 different lots. But for Central and South, I've given the figures of 133 and 83 that are coming from the R100 procurement package that we're putting in. BT are putting in £34 million collectively into those 2 areas. So that takes the total, approximately, don't want to be too precise about it, but it looks like in the region of £34 million. And that would take the total investment in those 2 areas to 250 million, with 34 million of that coming from BT itself.
Okay, I'll park my questions for now.
I hope that's helpful.
We'll talk about a line intervention specifically later, I think. So.
Okay, thank you. Now, the next question is from the Deputy Convener, Maureen.
Morning, panel. If you were to provide the figures in a sort of table, giving us all that breakdown, plus what was covered by BT Openreach, and also the amounts from Scottish Government and UK Government, that would be really helpful. I think you've given us today a breakdown of the central lot, but if you could do that for the other areas.
I do that, Convener. If I could just interject on one point, I think in terms of the ongoing finalisation designs, we may not be able to give you final figures until later in the year, but we can give you, I presume, sort of
I think
approximation
you have
of what
an idea of the number of premises, how many have been covered already. So, for example, central, highly populated, more commercially viable. Compared to north and south. So that would be really helpful. In terms of the fibre to the premises, does that cover all commercial and domestic properties?
In terms of, for example, the south of Scotland, where we have specified that 99% of the target list of proper premises will get full fibre, that includes both domestic and non-domestic premises. So it should cover 99% of those that we were aware of that were not being covered by commercial operators. We will be delivering 99% of those with full fibre. It remains in the south just over 200 premises that will require another solution. It's a larger figure in central of about 7,000 within the R100 target list that will require an alternative. But yes, both areas, the solutions we set out cover both domestic and non-domestic premises.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Minister, can I just clarify the figures that you're going to provide the committee? Did I get the impression that it was for South, Central and North lot, or was it just for South and Central?
At this moment in time, Convener, just the South and Central. We were unable to, because of the challenge, we were unable to give figures.
I thought that was the case. I just wanted to clarify that. Yes, sorry, Peter.
Just a follow-up from Maureen's question about fibre to the premises, 100% almost fibre to the premises in the south area, for instance. Does that mean that folks that are connected a reasonable service in the south just now are going to get an upgrade and they'll also get fibre to premises, or are we just looking at what the R100 programme can deliver?
Just the R100s, Mr Chapman, yes. I mean, it's a good point to raise. We can only intervene in those areas that are already pre-cleared for state aid purposes, and that's the areas where there's no market solution provided to commercial operators. So, yes, in the south, for those premises, the 26,000 or just over 26,000 premises that we put into the R100 bid for the south, yes, they will get full fibre, 99% of them will get full fibre. But you're quite right to identify there are already, obviously, clearly lots of premises that already have a connection of one type or other. Now, it's not currently regulated, but operators such as BT have made their own sort of views known about what they would like to do in respect of premises that are on fibre to cabinet solutions or other solutions, and they intend to remove copper, for example. but that's not currently yet set in legislation or in regulation. It has to be done. But they've targeted, or they're suggesting a target date of 2027 to remove copper from those premises and replace with fibre. But that's a matter, obviously, for commercial matter at the moment, and it's not regulated. But I don't know whether Mr McGee can say something on that.
The only other point to add to that, I guess, is that the premises that you've outlined, I guess that's where the UK government have indicated that they've got a further investment programme, talked about £5 billion. So again, it would be those premises that currently can access superfast speeds but are not on a full fibre connection. Presumably those premises, if not in line for an upgrade commercially, would be part of that rollout. Just to
finalise, and does that mean that these existing premises with fibre to cabinet, for instance, are all receiving at least 30 meg?
The ones that people may be on fibre to the cabinet connections and not be receiving 30 megabits per second, but all of those premises are in the R100 intervention area.
Ah, okay. Okay.
And I think you've got to follow up, and then you've got some other questions.
Thanks very much, Convener. Can I just follow up on that very point, though, because, Minister, you talked about state aid rules, but in many ways you're actually changing the goalpost, because what you're now saying is that the R100 is effectively fibre to premises. And what you'll have in, say, the south is the commercial side delivering fibre to premises in some holes, for example, new build. You'll have R100 delivering fibre to premises. And then you have this big, huge gap in the middle of people who are not going to get fibre to premises because it's not commercially viable. So surely that group of people now comes into the market failure side of things, because you're effectively creating a group of people who that are not part of the commercial fibre to premises. They may have reasonable speeds, but future-proofing, that's another issue. But these people will never get fibre to premises from the commercial side, and they're not part of R100, so they're effectively being missed out by the fact you've kind of moved the goalposts.
I would like to say that I think there might be a bit of confusion about this matter, so I'll try and clarify it now, because I appreciate if we're causing confusion, I want to address that right now. Clearly, what we're saying is, and Robbie has outlined the point around those who are already on a fibre to cabinet connection, they may have perhaps less than super fast standard speeds because they're at a long distance from a cabinet. So they might be more than a mile and a half, 2 miles away from a cabinet, therefore have a digression in speed the further away you get from a cabinet. They would be eligible for assistance from us to get to super fast service. But what we have done is we've identified those areas that we knew were not going to receive a commercial superfast solution, and we've had clearance, under the open market review process, and then getting state clearance on the R100 programme, which does take time. It's one of the contributing factors to how long these procurements take. We've got clearance to help all those premises that are currently not receiving a superfast service. And obviously, in the case of the south of Scotland, the south of Scotland, it's true that 100% of the interventions in that area, and sums in total 99% of all the target list of premises, will be getting full fibre. In the central area, some will be getting fibre to the cabinet, but it is a vast majority of premises will be getting fibre to premises there as well. But there are some premises which are close enough to a cabinet to get a super fast speed from a fibre to cabinet connection, if that makes sense.
It does, but you accept that however, we are effectively still have a big group of properties that do not have fibre to premises, that in terms of future-proofing, they may have what we may define as super fast broadband at the moment or soon, but they are not fibre to premises. And in fact, you've got this kind of two-tier where the R100 is delivering that for people. The commercial side of things will deliver that in the centre of Edinburgh, but they'll never deliver it in Galashiels or Hoyk or areas like that. And this big group of people are effectively not going to have fibre to premises.
Well, we have to come back to what we're trying to achieve here. First of all, just to remind members, I'm sure members of the committee know this, that the broadband, as is all telecoms, is a reserved area. Now, we have targeted intervention in the case of Scottish Government on economic development grounds to try and make sure that everyone has a super fast connection. Now, in many cases, as I outlined in my statement, we're now able to go further than just giving a super fast connection. So we're using the money in a way which is now going to deliver a very high percentage of fibre to premises for those customers. But the government's commitment was to address super fast. As Robbie McGee has outlined earlier on, the UK Government has made a commitment itself to spend £5 billion on trying to provide gigabit-ready services across the UK. That is the government that's responsible for telecoms. Now, that £5 billion, we would argue we need to see a fair share of that allocated to Scotland. Now, if additional funding comes in through that source, then of course we'll try and work with UK ministers and support them to make sure that money is used effectively to try and provide full fibre for customers across Scotland. But that is not part of the original R100 procurement. That has come on subsequently. And I would hope that we'll have the maximum benefit for Scotland. We stand ready to work with UK ministers to try and make sure that is as effectively used as possible to deliver the best outcomes for those customers who are on perhaps fibre to cabinet and haven't got any immediate prospect of getting fibre to premises.
I'm sure we'll have a debate in the future about how we get to the point of full fibre to premises, but that's a debate for another day. But the original government commitment to R100 was for 100% of premises in Scotland to be able to receive super-fast broadband by 2021. Can you just clarify for the record what the timescale is now for the south and the central lots to get 100% in those two areas?
Well, we are setting out that anyone who cannot access super-fast broadband, either commercially, which we talked about, or via the R100 contracts themselves, which I can touch on the timescales for that as well, by the end of 2021 will be eligible for the aligned intervention. So if a customer wants a super-fast connection, a minimum of super-fast connection by the end of 2021, they can get one under the proposals we're putting forward. And as a result of the voucher schemes, that's our way of trying to honour the commitment we've given around the end of 2021 being the deadline that was in the commitment, but also allowing for what I believe is going to be a better outcome in terms of the very high share of premises that are now going to get a fibre to premises outcome as a result of our money, rather than just going down to delivering a super fast only service. So effectively they'll get for the vast majority of premises in central and south that we can talk about, they will get a service which is more than 30 times as fast as the European standard for superfast as a result of the money we're putting in. So we touch on, in terms of timing, I've touched upon anyone who requires access to superfast broadband by the end of 2021 will be able to get that. But in terms of contract build, we expect delivery in central Scotland to be completed by the end of 2023. So that's Q3 2023/24. In the south of Scotland, we expect contract build to be completed in the summer of 2024. And in the course of 2024-25 final year, there'll be the final about 1,400 premises that will get picked up. So the vast majority of that will be done by the end of 2023 as well. So the last tail end of that programme will stretch into 2024, about 5% of the build out in the south of Scotland.
Which realistically will be the option that people will go with rather than a voucher scheme. And obviously it will be disappointing to those communities that they'll have to wait an extra, in some cases, 2-3 years. What steps are the government taking to ensure that there will be absolutely no further delays beyond those revised timescales?
Well, certainly in terms of the contracts themselves, they're not the kind of traditional building contracts that you would use, say, for building a bridge or a road, where you've got penalties that you can apply. They are state-funded interventions, of course. They enable a contractor to deploy its own infrastructure in areas that are not commercially viable. There are no breach of contract provisions that we can use to ensure that they meet the deadline. But however, what I would point to is the performance in DSSB, and this point is relevant. The supplier has a big incentive to deliver early because they do not get paid and do not start receiving income from premises until, in terms of the customers actually signing up to services, until they are fully deployed. So the quicker they do it, frankly, the quicker they get paid, and that is what happened with DSSB. The similar mechanism used at DSSB, which brought the contract in on time and on budget. So I think we can be pretty confident. We've got an experienced, in the case of South and Central, which I can talk about, we've got an experienced contractor there, BT, who are used to delivering in these areas. They have got a track record of delivery under DSSB, and I think we can be pretty confident they will want to do it to get the money, and they will also do it effectively and on time. So I hope that is of some comfort to colleagues in the committee, that while it isn't the same as a construction contract for a bridge or a motorway or something of that ilk, where you have penalty, breach of contract clauses in the contract, we reputationally and in terms of getting paid, there's a big incentive for the operator to actually deliver on time.
Is a lack of the breach of contract penalties, is that a legal stipulation that you're not able to do that as a government, or is that a choice you've made?
I'll maybe ask Claire Blakey, if that's okay, convener, to comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's back to the nature of the contract, which is that we're not procuring an asset for ourselves. We're stepping in where the market has failed to effectively fill the gap and make the business case viable. So it's not that we've no breach of contract provisions at all. I mean, clearly there's material breach of contract provisions. There's long stop dates that would allow the contract to be terminated if they just sat and did nothing. But the key incentive in a subsidised contract like this is that you're not getting paid for what you've done until you've done it, and you can't get an income flow until the connection's there. So the biggest incentive in the world for the contractor is there to actually get on and deliver it. You wouldn't have been adding anything to that to put in provisions with LDs and the kind of thing that I think the committee are getting at here, and we would have paid for that privilege. I mean, the bottom line is you put things like that into a contract, you pay for them, but there's a fairly tried and tested gap-funded model that I think, as we said, has worked across the whole country in numerous procurements and contracts like this, where the private sector is incentivised to do what it is that they're asked to do on the timetable they've got.
They don't get paid a penny until they're finished, or
they get paid in milestones. So what I'm meaning is they don't get paid for any milestone until they come to us with a receipt showing us that they've done it and proving that they've done it. So they're out of pocket for that period of time. And in the end of the day, the only way their business case stacks up is as soon as they have customers paying money. And you can't have a customer paying money until you've got a connection.
I think it's also worth pointing out, just for, if I may, convener, just from the point of view of future analysis of the budget and obviously the performance against the budget, that payment is in arrears, as Ms Blakey has announced there. So you'll see a kind of a bit of mismatch between deployment on the ground and payment. So there's always, and it's true for DSSB as well, where we were paying in arrears to the contractor for having delivered, as Claire Blakey has set out. So that's a standard approach.
There's a follow-up from Colin. Sorry if you finish that. There's a follow-up from Mike Rumbles, and then we'll move on. I think, Jamie, you've got some questions as well.
Thanks, Convener. Just following on from your answers to Colin Smith, I can just quote when you came to the committee. I've got the official report here on the 30th of October. You said, to pick up on Mike Rumble's point about the political aim, we are absolutely committed to delivering 100% superfast coverage. I can say that because it's not a contractual issue, it is a political issue. The R100 procurement is the main means by which we're doing that, but we also have aligned interventions. And you've just said again to Colin Smith that if they're not getting it connected commercially, they can get a connection by 2021 with aligned interventions, but actually they can't, is it? I think use of language is very important. What you're actually offering people is a voucher from the end of 2021. So they're not going to get a connection by the end of 2021. And I'm a bit alarmed by the dates that you've just been mentioning in response to Colin Smith to 24, 25. I mean, we haven't even mentioned, of course, because of obvious delays with the North. There are people who have been expecting, and I have told them, based on the words that you've used to us, that they will get connected. That's what you said, by the end of next year.
Yes, and it appears that there's still confusion on this point. Any customer who wants a connection by the end of 2021 will get one. In terms of now, what I say is, in terms of aligned interventions, that might be an interim solution while they're waiting for the full fibre to be rolled out, but they will get a super fast connection, which is what the government commitment is, and what I reiterated at the last committee meeting.
Maybe this is why I've misunderstood you. Can I just clarify? So any of the people that have been contacting me in the North East, and I've been assuring them, you've said, they'll get connected by the end of 21.
They'll get a super
They'll not
fast...
just get a voucher, but they will get connected.
Yes, they will be entitled to get vouchers. What we and I appreciate
not
you're
entitled to, but they'll get connected.
Well, it's a demand-led voucher scheme, so it will require, and I would certainly welcome the assistance of colleagues around this table and indeed in wider Parliament, and when they have constituents contact them, looking for assurance around broadband connectivity, super-fast broadband connectivity, I should say, by the end of 2021, to please do, once we have the available information that we wish to communicate via yourselves and other routes, to make sure that they are aware of the ability to draw down a voucher, which will grant fund them getting at least an interim solution if they're at some point going to get an R100 deployment of full fibre, for example, or a fibre to cabinet connection through R100, but they can't wait for that to happen. They want that by the end of 2020. They want a connection by the end of 2021. They'll be able to get that through the aligned intervention scheme in advance of the end of 2021.
So I know you're trying to be, you're genuinely trying to be...
I'm trying to help.
I am genuinely trying to get, just so there's no misunderstanding in the future. So I have a constituent in the North East who says, I can't get connected. I'm going to need these aligned intervention. I know that, and we've been promised by the end of next
Yes.
year. So he doesn't have to wait till the end of next year
No.
to get a voucher. He
No,
can,
not
he can
at all.
actually approach.
Yes, we hope to have the voucher scheme launched by this summer.
Fine.
So those customers will...
My misunderstanding, and I
apologies. Well, it's also about communication. We've maybe not communicated it properly, but I want to reissue from this summer, hopefully we will have the voucher scheme out. And I know Mr Green's alluded to the fact that there'll be other points want to be raised in that, so I'll not labour the point. But the voucher scheme hopefully will be up and running by summer, and then you'll be able to communicate that to your constituents.
Jamie, you wanted to come in on that?
Yes, we'll segue nicely into aligned intervention. So, as far as I can understand, there are a group of people who, even with both the government procurement intervention, the commercial intervention, will fall outside and fall between the gaps. They'll either be too far from the cabinet, of which BT Openreach is contractually connected, but live too far away, or in extremely rural or difficult to connect part of the world. Is it my understanding of the contract that BT Openreach are simply being given a pot of money to fill in the gaps to deliver 100% coverage at a minimum speed, which by default therefore is technologically agnostic? So in other words, have you contracted BT simply to deliver a minimum speed in whichever means is available to them?
That's getting into contractual terminology, so I'll perhaps rely, if I may, convener on Claire Blakey if she can answer that question.
Yes, I mean, the BT, the bidders were tasked with taking a pot of money and covering as many premises as they could at 30 megabits per second. So to that extent, yes, they were to do it at minimum speed. However, I think coming back to the structure of the contracts and the outcome we've got, they're a commercial operation who want to put fibre out as far as possible. So what we've actually seen is not fibre to the cabinet across the piece. It's predominantly fibre to the premise, and that was their solution. That's what they're being contracted now to deliver to us. So I mean, if they've said they're going FTTP to a premise, they can't then change their mind and say they're downgrading it to FTTC, if that's what...
Right, so in other words, given that it's 100% coverage of all residential and commercial premises, and they've signed these contracts saying, yes, we will deliver that, thanks to what we're spending and thanks to the additional funding, are we saying, however, that there are households or premises, commercial premises, that will fall outside of both of those remits that will require additional funds, i.e. additional intervention from the government? If so, how much have you allocated for the aligned intervention?
Yeah.
And what technologies will be utilised to provide those households?
I mean, it's a fair point. Yes, the answer is obviously the 600 million covers the main procurement, so we will need additional resources to deliver the aligned interventions voucher scheme that we'll give further detail on by the summer. We are stand ready to provide that additional funding. We obviously are continuing to have dialogue with UK government colleagues around their plans for their £5 billion, and that we will offer an opportunity to provide additional revenue or capital funding for this. We've already committed, obviously have committed £21 million towards the total of 600 million already, so that's the 3.5% I've referred to earlier. And obviously any additional funding would perhaps enhance the quality of the offer that we can put through in terms of aligned interventions for those remaining properties that have fallen through the R100 procurement and haven't been covered by commercial developers. So we know that the take-up of the UK Government's rural gigabit voucher scheme in Scotland is a bit lower than they or we would like. In large part, that's because the level of subsidy available under the gigabit voucher scheme, which is about £1,500 for residential premises and £3,500 for SMEs, doesn't go far enough in some of the more challenging locations. And so therefore we have argued, and I think it's been positively received so far, that we could use our voucher scheme to add to UK Government voucher scheme, and this is something that we need further discussion on, to enable that money to go further for both of us and deliver a better outcome for the people concerned. So we're urging the UK Government to review the levels of subsidy available, and we certainly stand ready to supplement that funding through our own voucher scheme in Scotland, so it genuinely delivers a future-proofed outcome for all those affected. But we believe, and I hope you'd agree, this needs to be funded appropriately by both governments, not just ourselves, ideally by UK Government as well.
No, I totally understand that, and that's a very helpful answer, but I think just getting back to the premises that respectively your government made the commitment to reach the 100. So what I'm getting at is, do we have any understanding of what the government, I mean, you have to go and presumably ask the Finance Directorate for lots of money to fill in these gaps. So I wondered if you had allocated any estimated numbers to how much you think either the voucher scheme or any form of line intervention will cost the government. And on the voucher scheme specifically, what happens if the quotation to deliver to that house is an excessive sum of money? We've heard instances of in the tens of thousands, for example, to connect a premise for the most difficult to reach. Will they still be covered under the voucher scheme, and will funding be guaranteed available to them?
Well, certainly, we're going into this with our intention to try and help every premises, as I've reiterated to Mr Rumbles earlier. It's our intention, political ambition, if you like, to achieve that 100% coverage. Now, we will not know, just as BT, who are looking at doing the survey work at the moment for the detailed survey work on the ground for the central and south areas, will not know exactly what the solution is in each location. I think I've said before, you might need a cocktail of solutions in some parts of the country where you've maybe got in one valley. You can maybe do fixed wireless to a number of premises, but it won't work for those that are out with the reach. You can maybe put relay stations in and so forth to carry the signal up a valley, but we'll not know until we get on the ground. But our intention is to try and ensure that everyone gets a solution. Obviously, that'd be greatly helped if we can add our funding to UK government funding to make sure it goes as far as possibly can. And it'd be we would try to avoid any sense of an arbitrary cap, which I think to some extent the cap that's, and I don't want to be overly critical, but the cap that's there for the existing schemes, the voucher schemes that are there at present, is probably artificially low for the kind of premises we're talking about. And we have made that point gently to UK colleagues. So there's an opportunity here to be a little bit more kind of realistic and trying to make sure that we are going into it with our eyes open. In terms of the budget itself, and you're quite right, we wouldn't want to call Mr Mackay the Finance Director, he might take umbrage at that, but he's certainly the Finance Secretary. He will be aware through the budget process we have put in some indicative figures for what we believe is a new funding pressure that will come from the installation of the voucher scheme. Now, it is a demand-led scheme, so it'll depend on how many people come forward. We might have to adjust the figures as we go along, but we've certainly started that process and cleared the commitments we gave in the chamber with finance colleagues before we gave them. So they were aware of that and were comfortable with the kind of numbers we were putting forward. I just didn't
hear a number and all of that. So.
I don't think I don't want to prejudge the budget, but obviously we're not long to wait for that, convener. So there will be some numbers in around what we're expecting, and obviously the reprofile spend for R100 itself, taking account of the timescale. So, and I would just ask members to bear in mind that invoicing is in arrears, so don't automatically read that there's nothing happening when you see funding is some way down the line for the reasons that Claire Blakey has set out.
Stuart, you wanted to come in with a supplement?
I just want a quite narrow question about vouchers, because one of my colleagues will ask more about the online checker later, I think. But am I correct in understanding that the online checker, when it's available, will enable each individual household and premise to see the predicted date of delivery? And that those dates some will be before 2021 and some will be after 2021 because of in terms of the R100 programme. And that therefore you would expect the vouchers that people would be able to see that they need to apply for a voucher to draw it forward in advance of 2021 because their predicted installation date is beyond that. And related to that, I thought it was a short question, I've decided it's not quite. And related to that, is it only the people who've got a predicted date post-2021 who can claim the voucher?
Certainly on the point around the information that will be online checker, it is our intention, yes, down to premises level, including business and domestic premises, that each person will be able to see whether they're covered by the R100 programme, whether they'll be covered by the R100 programme within the timescale, the end of 2021. And we're not going to give a precise date whether there's a commercial rollout, whether that's going to happen, or indeed a precise date about when BT would be, in the case of South and Central, delivering the solution under R100. But we'd show whether they were eligible for the voucher scheme. And we'll try and keep that bit as simple as possible, so effectively if someone's eligible for a voucher scheme, they'll contact hopefully a single point of contact and therefore be directed to the right support through the voucher scheme rather than make it too confusing as to different options. But clearly in practice, some individuals will get effectively an interim solution because they're going to get a full fibre connection or a FTCC connection down the line. That may be beyond the end of 2021, if it's described earlier on, or if we know that they're not going to get covered by R100, they will have a more substantive solution provided through the aligned interventions voucher scheme, and that will be flagged to them. I don't know whether anything, Robbie, if I may, Convener, Robbie McGee might just want to add to what I've said.
I mean, it was just, I mean, I think just to say that the aim is for integration of that premises level checker with the voucher information. So I think there's a horrible phrase in my head about, and I apologise for using it, but the customer journey. So there's a lot of planning of that kind of website experience as to how people will be signposted and to make it as straightforward and seamless as possible.
Stuart, I think that you're happy with that. So the next, Emma, I think you're next on the list, Emma.
Convener, good morning. I'm interested in alternatives to digital fibre, and so what technically are the alternative means, and are we talking about like wireless delivery from radio masts or satellite or lease lines in order to, I guess, cover the gaps in the fibre coverage at the moment?
Well, as I said earlier on, in response to a point that was raised by Jamie Green, and responding to Emma Harper's point, the voucher scheme will be capable of delivering a range of technologies, and fixed wireless access and satellite broadband will have a part to play in that, we believe. We aim to maximise the quality of the technological solution on offer through the voucher scheme. So, but individual solutions will depend on a range of complex factors, including, as I alluded to with Mr. Green, geography, topography, and proximity to other alternatives. Satellite broadband, I know in the past has had a bit of a bad reputation, but what we can see is it is improving quite dramatically now in terms of upload and download speeds. And contracts are now available without data caps, which has been a big issue in the past in terms of people basically running out of the ability to use the data cap, and on their satellite service. And access speeds is also increasing. So we are actually proactively now engaging with suppliers of different technologies like fixed wireless, satellite, to sort of gauge their interest in the voucher scheme. And there's actually been a lot of proactive contact with us about the voucher scheme, people interested in being participating in that. I don't know whether there's anything that Robbie might want to add on that point, but certainly just to say there'll be a range of technologies. In some cases, it might end up being a fibre to premises solution that's provided. That's not with the scope of a voucher scheme. It's just obviously finding a cost-effective solution and hopefully one that's as good as possible within the realms of kind of rational spending of money in the case of each case.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think there has been a lot of preparatory work done in terms of scoping this. So we've done lots of spatial analysis of where the premises that will be part of aligned interventions are and clustering, and looking at that clustering with a view to determining what might be a suitable technology. So if they're within a certain distance of each other, they obviously lend themselves to a full fibre solution, others more fixed wireless. And we've then gone out, and what the plan is to do far more proactive supplier engagement, so that we're actually warming up the suppliers that exist within Scotland that may be quite small scale, but there's an opportunity for them with voucher funding to actually extend their own networks. So we'll be doing part of the R100 kind of resourcing plan that we've got includes, in effect, account managers to do just that. So we see that kind of proactive management of the supply chain is really important.
Just to clarify, the voucher scheme won't exclude alternative technologies?
No.
Right?
The only test really is that it must provide a service at least 30 megabits per second.
Okay. And so that was my other question, was about reassurances for...
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely must. It must be, and that's the European standard for superfast, so it has to be at least 30 megabits. And in many cases, I know myself, I've got a superfast connection through a fibre to cabinet connection in my local village, and in practice it's much better than that. It's 60 to 80, but but we want to make sure that people have at least 30, and that's the qualifying standard for anything we pay for.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Emma. The next questions are from the Deputy Convener, Maureen.
The voucher scheme is a joined-up process with the UK government. You said it will start in the summer. Are you confident that discussions with the UK government on this scheme will be on track for summer?
Well, we certainly, I should clarify slightly, we intend to go ahead with the voucher scheme. If we don't get the support of the UK government, we will go ahead with the voucher scheme regardless, because we need to provide a solution for those premises to honour our commitment. But what I would want to emphasise is we believe the best outcome would be to work in collaboration and to have UK government funding and our own providing a more comprehensive solution for some premises that will be more expensive to deliver. Clearly, we've been seeking, I've had positive discussions with Matt Warman, who's a Parliamentary Under-Secretary at DCMS, and with Nicky Morgan prior to the general election, and correspondence between us since, around the desire to collaborate with UK government. And they appear, to be fair, quite positive about that. They can see the sense in it, I believe, but there's still some discussion to go ahead as to some areas. For example, we think it would be advantageous to use the same platform that they're using for their own voucher scheme to simplify the process, to ensure that administratively it's as easy as possible. The reasons that Robbie gave earlier on, to try and make the customer journey as simple, but it also helps with effectively the kind of banker arrangements to make things as simple as possible for contractors. And they seem amenable to that. So I very much welcome that positive approach. There's still some mileage to go, and of course the big area that we don't know much about, and to be fair, I don't think the UK government are yet in a position to tell us, is the detail of their £5 billion programme, and whether they're going to have, we've sought reassurance that there isn't a rival kind of major public procurement going on at the same time, which would cause a massive confusion. I don't think that will happen, but we obviously still, until we see certainty about what their plans are, we're unsure about that. But clearly we want to see what scope there is for budget being allocated to Scotland, and that may influence the ultimate outcome in terms of the quality of the outcome that we can provide for each of those customers that are out with the commercial or R100 main procurement.
So it will be opened in the summer, and then it will be open-ended. And I'm just going to lump all my questions together,
okay,
because in the interest of time. So is there any eligibility criteria? And also, can voucher applicants club together so that they can get community broadband? For example, there's a scheme in northwest England called B4RN, a community partnership. Are these sorts of things going to be available to people in Scotland?
Well, certainly in terms of the eligibility, just to repeat the point in a kind of more formal way, anyone who cannot access superfast broadband by the end of 2021, and we will, to pick up the point that Mr Rummels raised, they will know that well in advance of that time, will be eligible for a voucher regardless of whether or not billed through the R100 contracts will ultimately reach them. So that's the kind of formal part of the eligibility. In answer to the part about clustering of potential customers to get a collaborative kind of solution, absolutely we'd be interested in that. And I think that's something that Robbie was alluding to. We're trying to look at the premises that would be covered by aligned interventions and do a bit of that ourselves to see if there's anything proactively we can do to encourage. But certainly if there's a community that thinks, actually, no, hang on here, we could get a better outcome if we all go for the one option, perhaps with one supplier, then that would be absolutely sensible. But I don't know whether maybe Robbie wants to...
I think the nature of planning and delivering broadband networks doesn't really lend itself to individual solutions. If an individual just decides on their own that they want a broadband connection and they've got a voucher available, pretty much all they will be able to get is satellite, with one or two exceptions. In terms of delivering something future-proofed, it does rely upon that demand aggregation, and we've kind of seen that. Maybe less so in Scotland than in other parts of the UK, but BT, for example, have got a programme called Community Fibre Partnership that's been used quite effectively to kind of pull in some community funding as well as BT funding and vouchers as well. And again, that would be absolutely valid in the same way that we're kind of seeing this as a continuation of a kind of existing voucher platform in many respects. Again, the opportunity would be there for that demand aggregation to take place in the way that it has elsewhere.
Sorry, can I just clarify something? I mean, and I should be clear that I benefit from a wireless line of sight system, which seems to work very well within the community. But there'll be some communities that can't do that and will have to rely on satellite. And I welcome the voucher scheme. I think it's good news. But what I want to just ascertain is satellite, which is probably the only other option, is vastly more expensive than a landline connection. So if a landline connection costs X, satellite may cost 2X. Will the voucher scheme take into account what the end user needs to get the R100 commitment that you gave them?
in terms of informing what solution is used based perhaps on their means, you know, to afford the service thereafter.
If the satellite connection is going to cost the person who can't get R100 £70 per calendar month, which it could do, will the voucher cover the £70 per calendar month?
I think in terms of the recurrent cost, no, I think as currently constituted, but we were discussing this in advance because we were aware of the strong interest in the satellite solutions, and I'll maybe ask Robbie to give the financial figures, which I can recall in great detail because it was a verbal discussion. But we are seeing the monthly cost of satellite coming down quite dramatically. There's more competition and the technology is improving, so the value of what you get per month is improving a lot. But
I understand that, but Minister, when you came to this committee, I look back and you did say that the person in the remote areas would not be forced to pay more than the cost of the person in the central belt. It appears this...
In terms of the capital cost, yeah, I mean, what we can't do, we're not allowed to intervene in, is the monthly payment that person makes. We don't have a route to influence that, other than perhaps it's something that we've seen. I think I've mentioned this in the chamber, actually, when we had a statement around there are parallels in areas like energy, where you have a social tariff, and there are options that perhaps something that could be considered by regulators and by the UK government as something that can apply across the whole of the UK. But if I may, because I know Robbie's looked at... Just
one answer would give me... answer to the question is simply that the voucher scheme that you're offering may not cover the additional costs which will probably be accrued by the people who cannot get R100. So it won't cover all the costs. It will go away towards it.
I think, you know, well, maybe ask Robbie to comment on this to back up what I'm about to say, but I think that the scope of what R100 could do is effectively the infrastructure that it funds. We can't fund the service. I would hope that in looking at the solution for the premises, if there was a serious issue about affordability, that would be raised by the customer. You know, there may be some scope for if there's options that one might be cheaper than the other. But certainly, I think R100, it covers the infrastructure costs. We're not, sadly, allowed to. I think this is a general point about state aid to actually subsidise. There obviously is a parallel when you look at the shared rural network. UK government are supportive of the shared rural network on the mobile connectivity. They are providing a state aid approved scheme to support the subsidised cost of the connectivity by mobile phones. That's something the UK government can do. We can't. But if I can maybe ask
briefly,
Robbie to comment on that.
I mean, just a very brief point is that we've had quite extensive consultation with the existing satellite market just to kind of get a handle on price trends. And indeed, I mean, Big Blue, who are the big kind of wholesale commercial satellite provider at the moment, currently offer a kind of unlimited superfast service, offer speeds well in excess of 30 megabits per second for around about $49.99 a month. And the downward pressure there with more satellites going up and more capacity is that monthly cost will go down over time, we expect. But obviously there's further discussions that we're having with wholesale providers about if there is a greater kind of demand within Scotland as a result of the R100 voucher scheme, again, can that flow through into the monthly cost that people will pay?
Okay, I hear that. I mean, I know Wi-Fi, if you go on a landline, maybe £28 to £30 a month, so another £20 on top of it would seem a lot of money to some people who live in very rural areas. And perhaps we can leave that there because there's lots of questions, and the next question is from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Yes, I want to speak a wee bit about the North Bundle. I mean, we do know that the whole awarding of the contract is held up because of a legal challenge. I realise there may be very little you can say, Minister, but I would ask you to give us as much detail as to how that is progressing and when we're likely to see an outcome and a contract signed by whoever.
I'm in doubly difficult territory here, Convener, and I'd love to be able to give Mr Chapman the answer I think he rightly deserves, and colleagues around the table deserve around the North Lot. The sad truth of it is that I can't comment on the North Lot whilst it's subject to legal proceedings, so apologies, I'm reading from the notes here at this point. But as soon as I can give an update to the committee, I will. We obviously, as any litigant or respondent to a litigation, we want that as heard as quickly as possible, but we can't influence the Court of Session. That's quite rightly a matter for them to decide based on their workloads. they know best when they can accommodate it, and we just have to trust that it will happen as soon as they can accommodate that case. But what I would want to stress, because I think it's relevant to obviously members such as yourself, Mr Chapman, and indeed the convener, and Mr Rumbles and Mr Finney, I'm looking around the table, lots, and Stuart Stevenson as well, and Maureen Watt, so pretty much most of the committee covered by the North Lot area, that all those customers who are affected by the current legal case in the North Lot will be eligible for the Aligned Interventions voucher scheme. So if there is a consequential delay, and we will know, obviously, once we get the online checker on for that area, contact area, what people face in terms of delay, then they will be eligible for aligned intervention. So they can get a super fast, and I want to reiterate that point, every person, regardless of which lot area they're in, if it looks like they won't get a connection by the end of 2021 through what we're doing through R100, they can get a super fast service through the intervention, through the aligned intervention scheme or voucher scheme to do that. So I just want to reassure people that that is a route. So while it's disappointing we face this legal challenge, it shouldn't prevent someone who needs a connection by the end of 2021 getting one. It may be an interim one if they're going to get an R100 solution in the long term, as I've said, and this applies to North as well. But they will get a service nonetheless, and then hopefully the R100 longer term solution comes in thereafter.
I mean, that's very positive, but you know, it would seem to me that you're going to be inundated with huge numbers in the North area in particular, given the fact that we're obviously, the whole thing's delayed and we don't know how long it's delayed. Do you really think that the aligned intervention scheme can cope with what might come forward, you know, in the next 18 months or so?
Well, I think this is where the engagement that Robbie's outlined in terms of with different suppliers, potentially of alternative solutions, whether it's satellite or fixed wireless broadband, can actually really help. Because if we're proactive, we've got account managers effectively for those businesses. As I say, we've got strong interest in the voucher scheme already before we've even published the detail of it. So I'm confident there will be suppliers that are willing to step in. Now, can we say that it's going to be easy in every case to provide a solution? No, but there's certainly a commitment on our part to make that happen. And we seem to be reasonably well placed in terms of the interest in providing services through the voucher scheme. So I'm encouraged by that. I don't know whether, if with your forbearance convener, I can maybe bring Robbie in just to comment on the engagement, the interest we've had from particular suppliers that maybe apply in the North Scotland area.
Yeah, as the Minister says, I mean, through the open market review process, we obviously have a good sense of operators big and small that are out in Scotland and have ongoing engagement with them, structured engagement, to determine how planned commercial build is going. And obviously we're using that engagement to introduce the concept of vouchers, and as I said earlier on, to try and see if there are opportunities for them to kind of organically grow their network utilising this funding. So I think that will only increase once further details of the voucher scheme are released. And obviously, as I say, I think that will hopefully help us plan a more managed transition for some of these networks to get a bit bigger.
I mean, the other concern I have is, you know, that people will apply for the voucher scheme, get a system in place to allow them to have at least 30 megs. But in a year or two's time, there's going to be fibres to the premises at, you know, the best outcome we can get. So you've almost delivered twice on that community, if you know what I mean. You're going to deliver something meantime, and then you're going to deliver a better system later on. There's a double cost there, you know, and I'm not complaining about that, but I just no, I'm not. No, I'm not complaining about that, but I do realise that, you know, we need value for money. We all need that. I've run a business all my life, and I know that, and you know, I can recognise that issue, but that's something that you're prepared, Minister, to take on board.
Well, yes. I mean, we obviously, as I alluded to, I think when I was responding, I think it was to Mr Green earlier on, that you know, we had to go through the normal procedure you expect before we make a parliamentary statement to check the veracity of what we're going to be pledging to do in the chamber on the voucher scheme. So we've been in touch with colleagues in finance. It's been cleared an appropriate route through that process. We've had to make some working assumptions about demand and the take-up. So obviously, as you say, people might be quite happy to wait, you know, for full fibre, but I know there'll be many customers for whom it's absolutely urgent to get particularly businesses, those who are working from home or needs broadband connection for other purposes. There may be high demand for those individuals, but we made a commitment and we're trying to honour it. So that's what we have had to take on the chin. But you're quite right, we're not taking an interim solution through a voucher scheme will not rule someone out getting the R100 roll out. So it would potentially, in that situation, mean there's additional cost for those customers, but that's why it goes beyond the original 600 million budget that Mr Green raised earlier on. So we're providing top-up funding to make sure that happens.
I have a brief follow-up.
Yes, it's a question that might be of interest to other members, but I will illustrate it with a local example, and that's the arbitrary line that's carved up the country into north, central and south. My understanding is, if you take the example of Cunningham North, that it's in both lots, north and central, which means that a rural, south or north and central, indeed, it's been carved up. Could the Minister explain how that decision came around? Because clearly, if you live on Arran, you're in one lot, but if you're in Ardrossan, you're in another, and that might be a disappointment to islanders, for example. So what can be done to try and improve outcomes within constituency boundaries?
It's a fair question. Certainly the areas have been decided on the basis of trying to get the combination right in terms of having sufficiently attractive areas to attract bidders to bid for them. Obviously, as we've discussed, I think previously, both in the Chamber and here in the committee, we had strong interest in all three lots right the way through till almost the end, and ultimately we ended up with only single bidders for Central and South. But you know, I think I suppose we can take some confidence in the way we packaged up the areas. We did get a bid in each area, and if you think about some of the terrain that is involved and the challenges with the islands such as Arran, Cumbria and so forth in North Ayrshire, it wasn't a given that necessarily people would bid to do that work. So we had to get the balance right between the amount of subsidy for each lot, the mix of attractive areas to do commercially versus areas that would clearly need subsidy to make them viable to get the right kind of package up in each area. So all of the islands, inhabited islands in Scotland, are in the north lot, but there are so that's why the division has happened in the case of North Ayrshire. So you've got the mainland being in one lot and the islands being in another, and that's to provide I guess a balanced package between the three areas. That is, in the case of the north, has got much more subsidy than central, which is an area that's more suitable for commercial rollout. So it's got less subsidy, but it's got attractive areas that commercial operators would like to be in anyway. So we're seeing a kind of the balance between the amount of subsidy provided for each lot. There's more money provided for the south for a similar reason to the north. Some challenging terrain there in topography, and I hope we've got the balance right. We have had bids for all three areas, and I think we're getting. Obviously, I can't comment on the north, but certainly in the south and central, I think we've had a good outcome for those areas, and so from that point of view, the areas have worked.
If the islands are in the north lot, which will be the last to reach 100, if the decision to put all the islands in that lot, was that a decision that was island proofed or impact assessed?
Obviously predates the island community impact assessment tool, which is still in development, but I perhaps asked Claire to comment on the structure of the areas, because I know that a lot of thought went into getting that right to attract commercial interest, or maybe perhaps it's Robbie. Sorry, it might be Robbie, convener, that might be more appropriate to answer that.
I'm happy to.
But certainly, it's not something that could have been done at the time in terms of island community impact assessment tool. But clearly, I hope you'll see ultimately that we've got a good outcome for islands as well.
I think that, I mean, I'm sure you could explain that in greater detail. I'm very happy, I'm sure, for the committee to receive a letter to explain that point in further detail.
Absolutely.
The problem is we are quite short of time, Minister, and there are lots of questions.
Just before you move on, convener, if you will, given the delay in awarding the contract to the North Lot, have you any idea when the completion of R100 in the North is going to be, when it will be complete?
I think, Minister, you're going to say there's whole sorts of issues there, and in fairness, a good try, Mr. Chapman, but I'm not going to let you put that question to the Minister, because I don't think he's in a position to answer it legally.
Unfortunately. Yeah. Apologies.
Unless you want to.
I wish I could, but I can't, I'm afraid. Okay. But thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Richard Lyle has got the next question.
Good morning, Minister. Or should I say good afternoon? R100 contracts differ from Digital Scotland Superfast Superfast Broadband DSSB programme contracts in that they are premises based. When will members be able to view their or this premises level data, and how future-proof are the contracts in terms of housing currently being constructed?
Well, on the first point, it's certainly our intention, certainly for central and south premises, where we have certainty, we've got a contract signed, we're working with BT on their survey work, we should be in a position to have the online checker populated with the data for the R100 contracts and our knowledge about commercial and voucher schemes by summer of this year. So that we're aiming obviously to do that as soon as possible for the North lot once we know the outcome of the court case, which will determine which of the two bidders actually has won the work, and therefore will have an implication for the pattern of delivery. But certainly for the south and central, we'll hope to have that in place for the summer, and we'll do that as soon as we humanly can for the north thereafter. So I hope that will be helpful to members, and it will be down to premises level, as Mr. Lyle has alluded to. So that will allow the precision of knowing, unlike DSSB, where the information was published at a postcode area level and didn't provide the clarity perhaps that people needed as to if their own premises were going to be benefiting from a rollout in their postcode. This will tell them precisely what's going to happen for their premises.
And it'll be future-proof for future house building.
In terms of house building, that is a matter that the contracts that we have in place are obviously stated compliance. They can't be They can only be target areas of market failure that we know about. So obviously future houses coming on stream may not pick up, will not be picked up by R100. But new builds cannot be considered as a market failure, because obviously you've got to get time to see if market actually works to deliver for the premises that have just been built. And so they weren't in scope for the contracts. But where we are doing is we're working proactively with the industry, the telecoms industry and UK government to address this issue at source, and hopefully ensure that all new homes are built with future-proof broadband connections included from the start. So taxpayers should hopefully not be asked to foot the bill for this by default. And I should say BT, Virgin Media and others have made great strides with developers already in terms of ensuring that any and all new builds have full fibre installed wherever possible. So typically I think any development with more than 20 premises has almost been a kind of a no-brainer, but obviously they're prepared to work with smaller developments as well and sort of look at solutions. For our part, we've already made provision in the Scottish planning policy and the national planning framework with regards to digital infrastructure, and further legislation in relation to new builds is being considered at a UK level at this moment in time. We're supportive of that in principle. We've had engagement with DCMS at official and ministerial level to understand the implications for devolved policy, if there are any, and we would of course support its implementation during the course of the current UK Parliament.
I'll roll my other questions into one if for time-wise. The committee have previously heard that around 180,000 premises across Scotland are eligible for R100. Is this figure still accurate, or can the Minister provide updated figures? And can you confirm, as already has been said, an expected timeline for the launch of the online checker?
Okay. Well, certainly on the first point that Mr Lyle raises, we believe there are now approximately 150,000 eligible premises rather than 180,000. And this number can be explained by an increase in commercial activity across Scotland, which has partly been prompted by the 10-year rates relief that we have provided in last year, which is granted on any newly lit fibre. That's a double the level that there is across the UK. So it's 5 years cover for the rest of the UK and 10 years in Scotland. I would highlight that I believe that may be something that should be in members' minds next week when we have the discussion around non-domestic rates, being a nationally set rates relief scheme. So just put that one out there for colleagues around the table, just to flag that up. There's a risk that that may be lost depending on what happens next week. But we certainly, we know it's been very influential in securing further investment from, I do that in a light-hearted way, convener, with members around the table. But it is a serious point. The rates relief scheme we know is having an impact already. It is securing inward investment into infrastructure, and that has resulted in a drop from about 180,000 to about 150,000 now. And just to reiterate the point, the online checker that Mr Lyle referred to will be hopefully ready for the summer, with the proviso that the north data may take longer to populate.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just trying to do some time management here, Minister and members, and I'm trying to get as many questions in as I can within the time frame. And I was going to adjust things, but I'm actually going to go straight on and ask Angus to ask his questions that he had, and we'll keep going for as long as we can to allow us to complete our other business. And we'll have to just be flexible to where we get to. So, Angus, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Acutely aware of time pressures, so I'll be as brief as possible. I think, Minister, it's fair to say that gain share has proven to be a godsend for a number of communities who've been connected earlier than expected through the 2 tranches of gain share funding for DSSB. 29,000 premises in the first tranche and 7,000 in the second. So is there likely to be further funding made available for DSSB through the gain share mechanism?
There's certainly, as things stand, there's no further prospect of additional accelerated gain share through the DSSB contracts. Because our 100 programme is now ramping up, the DSSB programme will effectively be complete deployment in the first half of this year. So what we've tried to use is the DSSB to minimise any gap between the gain share funding, to minimise any gap between the original DSSB programme and R100 kicking in. So that is completing in the first half of this year, and then move into a sort of managed closure of the programme thereafter. And so that is going to be tackling a number of areas in Scotland, which we can perhaps provide detail to the committee of. I appreciate time constraint today. But there are some areas which we can identify for members, some of which are in relative to your own constituencies, where this is being targeted in the first half of the year.
Okay, perhaps you could write in with this as well, but it'd be good to get an explanation as to how gain share is being deployed currently and what criteria is used to decide where the funding is going.
If I can, this probably would be helpful, just to say that it's primarily focused on uplifting speeds in areas, the current round of gain share money, in areas where premises are already connected to enabling infrastructure. So, for example, taking those on lower speeds up to at least 24 megabits per second, which is the UK sort of superfast standard, or completing build in postcodes that are currently only partially served by fibre, and extending existing and planned build to complete build in the area. So, there might be, I think we've heard examples before where people are frustrated because they see investment in the area and then why am I not being picked up? This hopefully will help. This last round of gain share funding will help in some of those communities, and it will complement R100 delivery with DSSB and R100 teams hopefully working very closely together as we kind of manage that closure of DSSB as we ramp up R100 investment.
Okay, that's great, thanks.
Thanks, Angus. Richard Lyle, you've got the next question.
Yeah, I'll be, again, roll these together. Monitoring evaluation plan for the 5G strategy, is that going to be publicly accessible, yes or no?
I think we are developing that, yes, and would hopefully make that publicly available.
That's all I need. Will the committee see outputs from the Scottish 5G Centre, yes or no?
Well, the 5G Centre is pretty more complex. The 5G Centre, they're currently advertising for the Chief Executive, but yeah, there's a lot more I can say on 5G if that would be helpful to the committee.
Minister, I think what would be helpful, and maybe with the approval of Mr Lyle, is maybe if you could write in with some of these questions. I mean, are there some there that you would particularly like to pose, or would you be happy with the committee clerks?
I'd be happy with I don't have anything else. I was just trying to be brief. Thank you.
So, on that particular
we can give an update on 5G strategy.
I'll maybe ask the clerks to identify the areas that Richard was going to ask you. Jamie, do you have some questions that you could ask? I mean, or yeah, within some of them?
I think with the benefit of time, given they're quite technical and may require longer answers to the Minister, I'll maybe just wrap it into one question, and then we could maybe write to the Minister if we have additional things to ask around the specifics. But it's really just for your initial response to the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland's report, which I think was very interesting and very welcome. But it did make a specific call that there should be full fibre in Scotland by 2027. And given the revised timetables for R100 we have, that sounds to me like somewhat of a challenge to roll out full fibre across the whole of Scotland. So I just wondered if that's something you're cognisant of, if there's a positive working relationship with the UK Government, civil service at the very least, if not ministerially, on developments in that area, and if you could perhaps write to us with more details about how you think that might be achieved, and if not, when it might be achieved.
Absolutely. Well, we will write in more detail to help on this issue. But can I just say we certainly welcome the report, the ICS report. I think it is very positive in terms of the value, the benefit of investing in digital infrastructure. In response to the specific point that Mr Green raises around the extension of full fibre, I would say that, obviously, despite it being reserved, the report does recognise the Scottish Government's leadership role in digital connectivity, and it's clear from the report they recognise also that our investment R100 will make Scotland one of the best connected places anywhere in Europe, and I'm quoting directly from them. But in terms of extending full fibre to all, we believe it's critical that with R100 having accelerated full fibre delivery in Scotland, and certainly the areas that we've discussed already with Mr Smith and with yourself, we believe now UK Minister's ambitions will be contributed to by that very substantially, and they must now deliver the funding needed for Scotland to achieve ubiquitous full fibre coverage by 2027. As I said earlier on, I think it was to maybe Mr Chapman, around the issue of the 2027 date, that it's not set in regulatory terms or in statute anywhere. It's currently kind of a voluntary initiative on the part of companies like BT, but we clearly recognise the UK Government's committing £5 billion to tackling this issue. We do have a good relationship at not just official level. I'm trying to build a relationship at ministerial level, and I think we do generally have positive discussions. So I see huge potential for collaboration with UK ministers if we get this right, and I'm encouraged, like I say, with discussions with Matt Warman and Nicky Morgan, but we need to now see that funding come through, clarity about it initially, and then discuss how that's then allocated. Would be very helpful indeed.
Minister, there are some other questions which other members wanted to ask, and the other members have agreed that we can write to you, subject to getting a response from you, and there may be some more detail required in some of the last questions that were asked, which the clerks will write to your office with. So, on that basis, what I'm going to do is thank you and your team for coming along today. I apologise that it was slightly rushed. The timing seemed to have concertinaed this morning, and I don't seem to have managed the time as effectively perhaps I should have done, for which I apologise. And rather than suspend the meeting, I'd thank you and ask you if you could quietly depart while we continue with the matters the committee.
Thank you very much, Convener. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Minister. So, move to agenda item 3, which is direct payments for farmers, legislative continuity bill 2020. Now, I just want to remind members at the outset that I do have a registered interest in that I'm a partner in a farm before I talk about this. And if anyone else is going to talk about it, Stuart, you'd like to make it?
I'm a part owner of a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income.
I am a partner in a farming business. I'm not sure if I'm going to comment or not, but I will make that declaration anyway.
Okay, thank you. So we've received a consent notification in relation to one UK SI as detailed on the agenda. This instrument is being laid in the UK Parliament in relation to the direct payments for farmers legislative continuity bill. I wondered if anyone has any comments. John.
Thank you, Convener. Just very briefly, it's in the remarks in our paper about greening, and I would be very keen that we did clarify with the Scottish Government whether it was just imprecise language or any intended change of policy on that important issue, please.
Okay. So imprecise language or what? Yeah. Does anyone else have any comments? I just wondered when we were writing to clarify the points that John Finney's made, whether we should highlight our concern just about governance and reporting of these instruments without laying the blame on anyone in particular. It puts the committee under a huge amount of pressure dealing with this, and it might be good to clarify with them where this came from. Deputy Convener.
Well, I'd just like to point out that I happened to be watching Westminster yesterday, and it was only yesterday that they passed their direct payments for farmers legislative continuity bill yesterday afternoon. So the whole thing is rushed, not just from this government, but as a result of Westminster not knowing what it's doing.
I absolutely don't think I was pointing the finger at this government. I think as a general thing, as a committee, we're under quite a lot of pressure to get these things turned around quickly, and I think it might be worth pointing that out for the government to respond to as they see fit. Is the committee happy to do that? If you're not happy to do that, we'll just go with the point that John Finney made. John.
I am very happy we do that, but I think, as the Deputy Convener said, there's no debate where the responsibility for this lays. It lays with an inefficient and ineffective UK government putting demands on the Scottish Government, which in turn are demands on our clerks and our time. So I don't think that's in doubt. I mean, these are just simple matters of fact.
Richard.
Oh, maybe while we're writing, we should be asking what exactly is the problem. And I agree with my comments of my Deputy Convener and also the comments of John Finney, because funny enough, yesterday I was watching it too.
Okay. Okay, so sorry?
In the back, he says, how come you got time to sit in the background?
Okay, so perhaps we, when we're raising the point that John Finney raised, we can actually just raise the procedure and why it's happened. And I think that would be useful for us to know and useful for us to see in the future how it works. So are the committee content with that? Agreed. Okay. We are now going to move into private session.